A mail-order husband arrives broken, haunted by war, unable to stay anywhere long. Evelyn Hart needs help on her Dakota ranch, but the hollow-eyed man stepping off that 1887 train looks like he's already given up on living. When tragedy strikes and forces him to choose between running again or fighting for something real, everything changes. This is the story of two wounded souls who found healing in the last place they expected. Stay until the end and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The late afternoon sun hung low over Hollow Creek like a copper penny pressed against faded denim, casting long shadows across the wooden platform where Evelyn Hart stood with her father's pocket watch clutched in one gloved hand. The metal was warm against her palm, worn smooth by decades of worry and waiting. She'd checked the time 17 times in the past hour, though the train schedule hadn't changed, wouldn't change, had been the same every Tuesday and Friday for the past 3 years. But today was different. Today, everything was different. The locomotive's whistle cut through the evening air, a long, mournful sound that seemed to carry all the loneliness of the prairie in its wake. Evelyn's breath caught in her chest, and she pressed the watch closed with a soft click that was lost beneath the growing rumble of iron wheels on iron rails. Around her, the usual crowd had gathered, homesteaders collecting supplies, the banker's wife meeting her sister from Bismarck, old Charlie Hendricks, who came to watch the train simply because he had nothing better to do with his remaining days. But Evelyn stood apart from them all, her blue calico dress pressed neat despite the dust, her auburn hair pinned up in a way that made her look older than her 28 years. She dressed carefully that morning, changed her mind twice, settled finally on something practical but presentable. A woman meeting her mail-order husband didn't need to look like she was going to a church social, but she didn't want to look like she'd given up entirely either. The train screeched and hissed as it pulled alongside the platform, steam billowing up in white clouds that caught the orange light and turned it gold. Doors opened, people emerged. A family with 3 children and too many trunks. A salesman with a sample case and a well-practiced smile. 2 cowboys who'd clearly spent the journey drinking away their latest wages. And then she saw him. Jonah Pierce looked nothing like the photograph he'd sent. That stiff, formal portrait taken in some St. Louis studio, where the lighting had been kind and the pose had hidden all the important truths. The man stepping down from the train car moved like someone who'd forgotten how bodies were supposed to work, each motion careful and calculated, as if he had to remind himself which foot came next. His coat was gray wool gone threadbare at the elbows, patched once or twice by unpracticed hands. His hat was pulled low, but not low enough to hide the hollowness in his eyes that looked past everything and everyone, focused on some middle distance that only he could see. He carried a single canvas bag, the kind soldiers used, faded and stained with what might have been mud or might have been worse. No trunk, no cases. Just that one bag slung over a shoulder that seemed to carry far more weight than canvas and cloth could account for. Evelyn's heart sank and soared simultaneously, a peculiar sensation that left her momentarily dizzy. This was him. This was the man who'd written 3 careful letters in response to her advertisement, each one shorter than the last, each one more honest about what he couldn't offer than what he could. "I'm a hard worker," he'd written. "Don't drink much. Don't talk much either. If you need a hired hand more than a husband, I can be that. If you need something more, I'll try my best, but I can't promise I know how anymore." She'd read that last letter 20 times before answering it. Something in the stark honesty had moved her. She'd had 7 responses to her advertisement, 7 men looking for land, for opportunity, for a fresh start in Dakota territory. 3 had written poetry that rang hollow. 2 had promised undying love to a woman they'd never met. 1 had listed his assets like a bank statement. Only Jonah Pierce had told her the truth. He was broken, and he knew it. "Mr. Pierce?" Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected, carrying across the platform chatter and the settling sounds of the train. He turned toward her slowly, and for a moment their eyes met. His were gray, she noted. Storm cloud gray, the color of the sky before lightning struck, and just as full of warning. "Mrs. Hart?" His voice was rough, unused, like a tool left too long in the weather. "Miss," she corrected gently. "Still, miss, I thought it better to wait for the legal ceremony before assuming otherwise." Something flickered across his face, Relief or regret, she couldn't quite tell. He nodded once, a sharp military movement that looked out of place in civilian clothes. Yes, ma'am, that's proper. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and extended her hand. It was bold, perhaps, but she'd never been one for standing on ceremony when practical matters needed attending. Welcome to Hollow Creek, Mr. Pierce. I hope the journey wasn't too difficult. He stared at her hand for a long moment, as if he'd forgotten what the gesture meant. When he finally took it, his grip was careful, controlled, his palm calloused and rough against hers. His hand trembled slightly, just enough that she felt it, before he withdrew as quickly as propriety allowed. The journey was fine, ma'am. The words were automatic, rehearsed, the kind of polite nothing that meant everything beneath it. Good. She clasped her hands together, suddenly unsure what to do with them. I have the wagon just there. It's about an hour's ride to the ranch. We can talk on the way. Or not. Whichever suits you. Talking's fine, ma'am, but his tone suggested otherwise. His eyes had already gone distant again, focused on that invisible horizon. They walked to the wagon in silence, her skirt swishing against the platform boards, his boots making no more sound than a ghost's footsteps. Around them, Hollow Creek was coming alive with evening activity, lamps being lit in windows, shop doors closing, the sound of hammer on anvil from the blacksmith who worked late. It was a small town, just 3 streets and a handful of hopes. But it was hers. Had been her father's, before the fever took him 8 months ago. Had been her mother's, before the birth that gave Evelyn life and took hers in exchange. The ranch had been her father's dream, then his burden, and now it was hers alone. 20 acres of stubborn prairie, a dozen head of cattle, horses that needed more care than she could give them. The house was solid. Her father had built well, but the fences sagged, the barn needed patching, and there were 100 tasks that required a man's strength, or at least a second pair of hands. She'd tried managing alone after her father died, had nearly succeeded too through spring and into summer. But the work was grinding her down day by day, and the loneliness was worse than the exhaustion. When Mrs. Patterson from the Mercantile had suggested a mail-order husband, Evelyn had laughed at first. Then she'd spent a sleepless night staring at the ceiling, adding up all the ways she was failing, and by morning she'd written the advertisement. Widow seeking honest man for marriage and partnership on Dakota Ranch. Must be willing to work hard and expect nothing fancy. Companionship and mutual respect more important than romance. Write to Miss E. Hart, Hollow Creek, Dakota Territory. She'd called herself a widow in the advertisement because it sounded more respectable than spinster, more understandable than the truth. That she'd been engaged once, 3 years ago, to Thomas Brennan, the banker's son, until he'd decided a ranch woman with dirt under her fingernails wasn't quite what he wanted for a wife after all. Better to let people think she'd loved and lost than to let them know she'd never been quite good enough to love at all. This is it. She gestured to the wagon, a simple farm wagon, nothing fancy, pulled by 2 sturdy horses named Bess and Barley. The seat's not comfortable, but the horses know the way home even in the dark. We should reach the ranch before full nightfall, if we leave now. Jonah swung his bag into the wagon bed with a practiced motion, then stood staring at the wagon seat like it posed some kind of threat. After a moment, he moved to help her up, offering his hand with the same careful formality he'd shown on the platform. Thank you. She settled herself on the wooden seat, arranging her skirts, acutely aware of how close they'd be sitting for the next hour. Close enough to feel his warmth in the cooling evening air. Close enough to hear him breathe. He climbed up beside her and took the reins without asking, which she appreciated. Her arms ached from the morning's laundry and the afternoon's attempt to shore up the fence line near the creek. She let him drive, let him have that much control, watching from the corner of her eye as he handled the horses with competent, quiet confidence. The first thing he'd done that seemed natural, unforced. They left Hollow Creek behind, following the rutted road that led west toward the low hills where her ranch sprawled across the valley. The sun was sinking fast now, turning the sky shades of amber and rose, painting the prairie grass gold. It was beautiful, the way only wild places could be beautiful. But Evelyn had learned long ago that beauty didn't keep you fed or warm. It's not much, she said after they'd traveled in silence for 10 minutes, the town now just a smudge of buildings behind them. The ranch, 20 acres, like I wrote in my letters. The house is small, 2 rooms downstairs, a loft above. There's a barn, a chicken coop, a root cellar. My father built most of it himself over 15 years. It's solid work, but it needs, well, it needs what one person can't give it alone. Yes, ma'am. His eyes stayed fixed on the road ahead, but she thought she saw his jaw tighten slightly. I want to be clear about expectations, Mr. Pierce. She turned to look at him directly, even though he wouldn't meet her gaze. I need help on the ranch. I need someone who'll work hard and stay through at least the winter, preferably longer. In exchange, you'll have food, shelter, and your name on a legal marriage certificate, if that matters to you. As for the rest, she paused, choosing her words carefully. This was the part she'd rehearsed a dozen times, lying awake in her narrow bed, trying to figure out how to be both honest and decent. As for the rest, I'm not expecting a love match, Mr. Pierce. I'm not a romantic girl, and I suspect you're not much for poetry either. But I do believe in respect, in partnership, in 2 people doing their best to build something together, even if they're not entirely sure what that something is yet. The ceremony can wait until you're settled, until you're sure you want to stay. And there's a bed in the barn loft, clean blankets, good hay. You can sleep there until we both feel differently about arrangements. Now he did look at her, just a quick glance, but enough for her to see surprise flicker across his features. You'd marry a man and let him sleep in the barn? I'd marry a man and let him choose where he sleeps, she corrected. There's a difference. He was quiet for a long moment, and she heard him take a slow breath, then release it. That's fair of you, ma'am. More than fair. Evelyn, she said, if we're going to do this thing, you should probably call me Evelyn. And I'll call you Jonah, if that's all right. Jonah's fine. He seemed to test the sound of her name silently, his lips moving almost imperceptibly. Evelyn. Good. She faced forward again, watching the familiar landscape roll past. Now, tell me about yourself, Jonah Pierce. Your letters were short on details. I know you were a soldier. The war ended 22 years ago, so you must have been young when you signed up. I know you've worked ranches in Montana and Wyoming since then, but that's about all I know. So tell me something true, something that matters. He was silent so long she thought he might not answer at all. The wagon creaked and swayed over the uneven road. The horse's hooves made a rhythmic sound against the packed earth. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out, hunting in the last light of day. I was 15 when I lied about my age and joined up, he said finally, his voice low and rough. Thought it would be an adventure. Thought I'd come home a hero. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. I came home to nothing. Family farm was gone. Bank took it while I was away. Parents were dead from the cholera. Little sister married a man from Kansas City and moved away before I even knew she was grown. I'm sorry. The words felt inadequate, but she meant them. Long time ago. His hands tightened on the reins. I drifted after that. Worked cattle drives, hired on at ranches, moved when staying got too hard. Never put down roots anywhere, never saw much point in it. And now? Now I'm here. He looked at her again, and this time his eyes held hers for several heartbeats. I answered your advertisement because I'm tired, Evelyn. Tired of moving, tired of running, tired of waking up every morning and not knowing where I'll be sleeping that night. I can't promise I know how to stay in one place. Can't promise I won't disappoint you. But I can promise I'll work hard, and I'll try. That's all I've got to offer, hard work and trying. She felt something shift in her chest, some tightly held knot loosening just slightly. That's more than most men offer. Most just promise the moon and deliver empty pockets. I don't make promises I can't keep. Good. Neither do I. She pointed ahead, where the road curved toward a stand of cottonwood trees. We're almost there, just over this rise. They crested the small hill, and there it was, her ranch, sprawled across the valley like something out of a dream or a prayer. The house stood sturdy against the darkening sky, its log walls golden in the last light, smoke rising from the chimney where she'd banked the fire that morning. The barn hunched nearby, weathered and worn but still standing. Beyond that, she could see the fence lines dividing pasture from prairie, the creek glinting silver in the distance, the hills rising purple and patient against the horizon. It wasn't much. but it was hers, and now perhaps it would be theirs. Jonah pulled the wagon to a stop in the yard, setting the brake with practiced ease. For a long moment, neither of them moved. They just sat there, watching the way the evening light played across the buildings, across the land, across all the broken and beautiful things that made up a life. "This is it," Evelyn said softly. "This is home." Jonah climbed down from the wagon, then turned to help her down. When her feet touched the ground, she looked up at him, really looked at him, and saw a man carrying so much weight it was a wonder he could stand at all. His face was drawn, his eyes haunted, his whole body held with the tension of someone waiting for the next blow to fall. "You don't have to stay," she heard herself say, though it cost her something to offer him that freedom. "If you take one look at this place and decide it's not what you want, you can take the wagon back to town tomorrow. I'll pay your train fare to wherever you want to go. No hard feelings, no obligations." He studied her face in the gathering darkness, and she wondered what he saw there. Kindness? Desperation? Loneliness, recognizing its own reflection? "I'll stay the night at least," he said finally. "See what tomorrow looks like. That fair?" "That's fair." She showed him around as the last light faded. The barn where the horses needed stabling, the chicken coop where the hens had already roosted for the night, the well with its good cold water, the house with its simple rooms and simpler furnishings. He followed quietly, taking it all in, asking practical questions about feed supplies and fence repairs, and where she kept the tools. "The loft's up there." She pointed to the ladder leading to the barn's upper level. "I put fresh blankets up this morning, and there's a pillow. It's not fancy, but it's dry and reasonably warm. There's a lantern on the post if you need light." "It's fine," he set his bag down near the ladder. "More than fine. I've slept in worse places." She wanted to ask where, wanted to know what worse places haunted a man's sleep, but the questions felt too intimate for a first evening. Instead, she said, "I'll have breakfast ready at dawn. Coffee, eggs if the hens cooperated today, biscuits. You can eat with me in the house, or take your plate out here if you prefer. Either way is fine." "I'll come to the house," he said, and it sounded like a decision that required courage. "Good." She started to turn away, then paused. "Jonah, thank you. For coming all this way. For giving this a chance. For being honest in your letters. It meant something to me. Means something." In the darkness of the barn, she couldn't quite see his expression, but she heard his voice, rough with something that might have been emotion or might have been just exhaustion. "Yes, ma'am, Evelyn. You're welcome." She left him there and walked through the cool evening air to the house. Her house, which suddenly felt less empty knowing someone else was on the property, even if that someone was a broken man sleeping in her barn. Inside, she lit the lamps and stirred up the fire, made herself a simple supper of bread and cheese and the last of yesterday's stew. She ate at the table her father had built, in the chair where he used to sit, and tried not to think too hard about what she'd set in motion. A mail-order husband, a man haunted by war and loss, a stranger sleeping 20 yards away. What had she been thinking? But she knew what she'd been thinking. She'd been thinking that loneliness was its own kind of death, slow and certain. She'd been thinking that the ranch required more than she could give it alone. She'd been thinking that maybe two broken people could build something whole, even if neither of them quite remembered how. Outside, the night settled over the prairie like a blanket. In the barn, a lantern flickered to life, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. And in the house, Evelyn Hart cleared the dishes, banked the fire, and climbed the ladder to her loft bedroom, where she lay awake for a long time, listening to the wind and wondering if the man in her barn would still be there come morning. The night passed slowly. She heard the horses moving in their stalls, heard the wind picking up, heard the distant howl of a coyote testing the darkness. And once, just once, she heard something else. A sound that might have been a shout, muffled and desperate, coming from the barn. She sat up in bed, heart pounding, listening hard. But the sound didn't come again. Whatever demons chased Jonah Pierce through his sleep, he was fighting them alone. Evelyn lay back down and stared at the dark ceiling, her father's pocket watch ticking steadily on the table beside her bed. Tomorrow would come. Tomorrow always came. And with it, all the questions she couldn't answer yet. Would he stay? Would he run? Could a broken man learn to build? Could a lonely woman learn to trust? She didn't know. But as sleep finally claimed her in the hours before dawn, her last thought was this: at least she wouldn't have to find out alone. In the barn, Jonah Pierce lay awake in the darkness, staring at the rough wood beams above his head, listening to his own heartbeat gradually slow from the panic of the nightmare. He'd learned not to cry out years ago, learned to strangle the screams before they could escape, but the dreams still came. They always came. He thought about the woman who'd met him at the train station, Evelyn Hart, who'd offered him a home and a chance and asked for nothing but honesty in return. He thought about how she'd looked at him without pity, how she'd given him space to breathe, how she'd said, "You don't have to stay," like she meant it. He didn't know if he could stay, didn't know if he remembered how. But for the first time in more years than he could count, a small part of him wanted to try. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. The prairie stretched away in all directions, wild and waiting. And on a small ranch in Dakota territory, two people slept separately, each wondering what morning would bring, each carrying more hope than they dared to carry in a long, long time. Dawn would come soon enough. And with it, the real work of learning whether two broken people could forge something stronger than the sum of their wounds. But that was tomorrow's question. Tonight, for the first time in years, Jonah Pierce slept under a roof that someone had offered freely, on land that might, just might, become something like home. And in the house, Evelyn Hart dreamed of fence lines mended and fields planted, and a future that didn't look quite so lonely as the past. The wind carried their separate dreams across the prairie, mixing them together in the darkness, weaving possibilities from nothing but hope and desperation and the stubborn human need to believe that tomorrow might be different from yesterday. Morning would tell. Morning always told. But for now, they slept, and the night kept its vigil, and the stars burned cold and bright above Dakota territory, witnessing the beginning of something that neither of them could name yet, but both of them desperately needed. Dawn broke cold and clear over the Dakota prairie, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that promised a beautiful day, and nothing about the work required to survive it. Evelyn woke before the sun cleared the horizon, as she always did, her body trained by years of ranch life to rise with the chickens and the responsibilities that never slept. She dressed quickly in the pre-dawn chill, pulling on her work dress and apron, pinning her hair up with practiced efficiency, moving through the familiar routine with her mind already cataloging the day's tasks. Feed the chickens, collect the eggs, start the coffee, make breakfast, check the fence line by the creek where the posts had been leaning dangerously for weeks, muck out the stalls, repair the barn door that kept swinging loose in the wind, except now, she reminded herself, she wasn't alone. There was a man in her barn, a husband who wasn't quite a husband yet, a stranger who'd promised to try, if he was still there. The thought sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the morning air. She descended the ladder from her loft bedroom, fed the fire until it caught properly, set the coffee pot on to boil, and then, before she could talk herself out of it, walked to the window that faced the barn. The door was still closed. No light showed from inside. No movement in the yard. Maybe he'd left in the night. Maybe he'd taken one look at the sparse accommodations and the hard work ahead and decided Montana or Wyoming or anywhere else looked better than here. Maybe she'd wake up to find his bag gone and the barn loft empty and herself alone again, which was what she'd expected all along, wasn't it? Better to expect nothing and be pleasantly surprised than to hope for something and have it torn away. But even as she thought it, she saw the barn door swing open and Jonah Pierce stepped out into the morning light. He'd clearly been awake for a while. His hair was damp, as if he'd washed at the pump, and he'd changed his shirt for one only slightly less worn than yesterday's. He stood in the yard for a moment, looking around at the ranch in the growing light, taking it all in with those storm cloud eyes that seemed to see too much and too little all at once. Then he walked toward the chicken coop with the deliberate stride of a man who'd already decided what work needed doing. Evelyn felt something unclench in her chest. He'd stayed. At least through the night, he'd stayed. She turned from the window and busied herself with breakfast, cracking eggs into the skillet, cutting thick slices of bread, setting the table for two. It felt strange, setting two places. She'd eaten alone for 8 months now, ever since her father's death. Before that, she'd set two places every day for 16 years, ever since her mother died. Setting two places now felt both familiar and utterly foreign, like returning to a home you'd left too long ago to quite remember properly. She heard his boots on the porch steps, the careful knock at the door. "Come in," she called, her voice steadier than her hands as she flipped the eggs. "Door's open." He entered slowly, removing his hat, looking around the interior with the same careful assessment he'd given the yard. The main room served as kitchen, dining area, and parlor all in one. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, a sturdy table sat beneath the window, two rocking chairs flanked the hearth, and shelves lined the walls, holding her father's books and her mother's few precious dishes. It was clean, orderly, spare, a life reduced to what mattered and nothing more. "Coffee's ready," she said, gesturing to the pot. "Cups are on the shelf there. Help yourself." "Thank you." He poured coffee into one of the tin cups, and she noticed his hands were steadier this morning than they'd been yesterday. The tremor was still there, but fainter, as if sleep, however troubled, had given him some measure of control back. "You need help with anything?" "You can sit down and eat when it's ready. After that, we'll need to feed the horses and check that fence line I mentioned. The posts are listing badly, and if we get a storm, the whole section might come down. I'd like to shore it up before that happens." He nodded and sat at the table, cradling the coffee cup in both hands, as if drawing warmth from it, though the room was already heating up from the stove and the fire. She dished up the eggs and bread, setting his plate before him, then taking her own seat across the table. For a few minutes, they ate in silence. The eggs were good, the hens had been productive lately, and the bread was from a batch she'd baked 2 days ago, still reasonably fresh. Simple food, but plenty of it. She'd learned early that there was no point in fancy cooking when you worked from dawn to dusk and fell into bed too exhausted to taste what you'd eaten anyway. "Sleep all right?" she asked finally, when the silence had stretched from comfortable to awkward. "Well enough." The lie was obvious in the tightness around his eyes, but she didn't call him on it. "The loft's fine. Better than I expected." "The nightmares will get better with time," she said quietly, keeping her eyes on her plate. "My father had them too, after my mother died. He'd wake up shouting her name, convinced she was calling for him. Took almost a year before they started to fade." Jonah's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "You heard me last night." "Just once. You didn't wake me. I was already awake, listening to the wind. I almost came out to check on you, but I figured you'd probably rather I didn't." "You figured right." He set his fork down, no longer eating. "I don't remember what I dream about most nights. That's probably a mercy." "Probably." She met his eyes across the table. "But if you need to talk about it, or if there's anything I can do to help, you only have to say so. I'm not much for midnight conversations, but I'm a decent listener when it counts." Something flickered across his face. Surprise, gratitude, maybe a hint of something that might have been hope if hope hadn't forgotten how to live in him. "That's kind of you, but talking doesn't help much with the things I dream about." "Then we won't talk about them." She finished her eggs and stood to clear the plates. "We'll just work. Sometimes that's the best medicine anyway, working until you're too tired to dream. I found that to be true." He drained his coffee and rose as well, automatically taking his plate to the basin near the pump. "Where do you want to start?" They spent the morning on the fence line, working in the companionable silence of people who understood that words weren't always necessary. The section near the creek had indeed taken a beating from the spring floods, and 3 posts needed replacing entirely, while 4 more required reinforcement. It was hard work, the kind that left your back aching and your hands raw, but Jonah moved through it with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd mended 1,000 fence lines in 100 different places. Evelyn watched him work and felt something settle in her chest. This was what she'd needed. Not romance, not poetry, not promises of devotion. Just a pair of strong hands and a willing back, and someone who understood that ranch work never stopped, never slowed, never gave you time to feel sorry for yourself. "You've done this before," she observed, steadying a post while he tamped earth around its base. "A few thousand times, feels like." He wiped sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. "Worked a cattle operation in Wyoming for 3 years, nothing but fence work from dawn to dusk, mending what the winter broke and the cattle pushed through. Boss used to say a ranch was only as good as its fences. Your boss was right. She handed him the next post. My father used to say the same thing. Said good fences made for good neighbors and better sleep at night. They worked through the heat of midday, pausing only to drink from the canteen she'd brought and to wipe the sweat that made their hands slip on the tools. The sun climbed high and merciless, turning the prairie into a shimmering expanse of gold and green, and Evelyn felt the familiar ache in her shoulders that came from this kind of labor. But Jonah never complained, never slowed, never suggested they stop and rest. He just kept working, methodical and steady, and she matched his pace because she'd be damned if she'd be the first to quit. By the time they finished, the sun had passed its zenith and was beginning its long slide toward evening. The fence line stood straight and solid, posts driven deep, wire strung tight. It wasn't pretty work, but it was good work, the kind that would hold through whatever weather came next. That'll do, Evelyn said, surveying their efforts with satisfaction. That'll hold through the winter, barring a catastrophe. Jonah tested the tension on the wire one more time, then nodded. Should hold fine. You've got good timber here. The posts your father set are still solid after all these years. He built things to last. She picked up the tools, distributing them between them for the walk back to the barn. He always said there was no point in doing a job if you were going to do it halfway. Better to do it right once than to do it wrong 3 times. Smart man. He was. She started walking, and Jonah fell into step beside her. He died last winter. Fever came through town, took him and 3 others before it burned itself out. He was sick for 4 days, and then he was gone. The Reverend said it was quick, as these things go. Merciful. I'm not sure mercy had much to do with it. I'm sorry. The words were simple, but she heard the genuine sympathy in them. Losing a father is hard. Losing a parent is losing a whole history. You lost both of yours. I did, but I was younger, and I'd already been away at war. Somehow that made it easier to accept, or maybe just easier to ignore. I could pretend they'd still be there when I finally went home, right up until I learned there was no home to go back to. They reached the barn and stored the tools in their proper places, hanging post-hole diggers and hammers on the wall pegs her father had installed decades ago. The barn smelled of hay and horse and leather, familiar and comforting in the way that home smells always were. I'll start on the evening chores, Evelyn said, pulling her work gloves back on. The horses need feeding, and I should check the chickens again, gather whatever eggs they've laid this afternoon. There's stew left from yesterday if you're hungry. You can heat it up on the stove. I'll eat after I'm finished out here. I can help with the chores, Jonah offered. No sense you doing it all yourself when there's 2 of us. She studied him for a moment, this man who'd arrived less than 24 hours ago and was already falling into the rhythm of ranch life as if he'd been here for months. His face was tired, drawn with exhaustion that went deeper than one day's work, but his eyes were clearer than they'd been yesterday. Less haunted, less lost. All right, she said. You take the horses. I'll handle the chickens. We'll meet back at the house in half an hour. They separated to their tasks, moving through the familiar routines that bound every ranch day together. Evelyn scattered grain for the chickens and collected eggs, 7 today, which was good production, while listening to the sound of Jonah moving through the barn, talking quietly to the horses as he measured out their feed. She couldn't hear the words, but the tone was gentle, patient, the voice of a man who understood animals and their needs. When she returned to the house, he was already there, stoking the fire and setting the pot of stew to warm. He'd washed again at the pump. His hair was damp and his face clean of the day's dust, and he'd rolled his sleeves up to his elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle and marked with old scars. Some looked like the kind you got from ranch work, jagged lines from barbed wire, puckered marks from hot metal. Others looked different, deliberate, made by things meant to harm rather than accidentally encountered. She didn't ask. Some stories told themselves when they were ready, and forcing them out early only made them harder to hear. They ate together again, this time with slightly less awkwardness, finding a rhythm of passing bread and pouring water and existing in the same space without constantly bumping into each other's boundaries. The stew was better the second day, as stew always was, and they finished the last of the bread with it. I can bake tomorrow, Evelyn said, clearing the dishes. We'll need bread for the rest of the week anyway, and I've got flour enough. I can do it if you teach me. Jonah carried his plate to the basin. I've made army biscuits plenty of times. Hard as rocks and about as tasty, but they kept you alive. If you show me how to make proper bread, I can take that job off your hands. She turned to look at him, surprised. You want to learn to bake? I want to be useful. You said you needed a partner, not a hired hand. Partners share the work, all of it, not just the parts that fit some idea of what men's work and women's work are supposed to be. Something warm unfurled in Evelyn's chest, a feeling she couldn't quite name, but recognized as something close to respect, or maybe gratitude, or maybe just the simple relief of being understood. All right, tomorrow morning, I'll teach you bread. Fair warning, my mother's recipe has a temper. The dough fights back. I've fought worse things than dough. He said it lightly, but the shadow that crossed his face suggested he wasn't entirely joking. The evening settled over the ranch like a held breath, the sky turning from blue to purple to deep indigo as the stars emerged one by one. They sat on the porch for a while after supper, not talking much, just watching the night come on and listening to the sounds of the prairie, insects singing in the grass, a coyote's distant call, the soft movements of the horses in the barn. Do you ever think about leaving? Jonah asked suddenly, his voice quiet in the darkness. Just packing up and going somewhere easier, somewhere that doesn't require so much just to survive? Evelyn considered the question carefully. I used to. Right after my father died, I thought about selling the ranch and moving to Bismarck, or maybe even going east to Philadelphia where my mother's sister lives. Thought about getting a job as a seamstress or a shop girl, living in a boarding house, having a life that didn't start at dawn and end at dusk with nothing but hard work in between. What stopped you? This place. She gestured out at the darkness, at the land that lay beyond what they could see. My father gave 20 years of his life to this ranch. My mother's buried on that hill there, under the cottonwood. Every fence post, every board in the barn, every stone in that hearth, they built it all with their own hands together. If I left, all of that would just be gone, forgotten, and I couldn't stand the thought of it. Jonah was quiet for a long moment. Sometimes staying is harder than leaving. Always, she agreed. Leaving is easy. You just put one foot in front of the other until you're somewhere else. Staying means you have to face everything you're trying to run from, every single day, and find reasons to keep choosing it anyway. And you found those reasons? Most days. She pulled her shawl tighter against the cooling air. Some days I'm still looking, but I figure as long as I keep looking, I haven't given up yet. He nodded slowly, and she thought she saw understanding in his profile, silhouetted against the starlight. That's wise. Wiser than I've been anyway. I've spent the last 20 years leaving places the moment they started to feel like they mattered, telling myself it was better that way, safer, easier to carry nothing than to risk losing something important. And now? Now I'm tired of carrying nothing. He stood, stretching, and she heard his back crack. I should turn in. Morning comes early on a ranch. That it does. She rose as well, gathering her skirts. Thank you, Jonah, for today. For the fence work and the help with the chores and for not running off in the night when you could have. He looked down at her, and in the dim light from the window behind them, she saw something in his expression that might have been determination or might have been fear or might have been both. I'm not much of a runner anymore, Evelyn. I'm too tired to run. So I guess I'll stay, at least until you give me a reason not to. I'll try not to give you reasons. She smiled slightly. And you try not to give me any either. Deal. They parted then, she to her loft and he to the barn, and as Evelyn climbed into bed and pulled the quilts up against the night chill, she thought about the strange miracle of the day. A full day's work done with half the effort because there were two of them. A fence mended that might have taken her 3 days alone. Meals shared and conversations begun, and the tiniest, most fragile beginning of something that might eventually become trust. It wasn't love. It wasn't even friendship yet. But it was a start, and she'd learned long ago that you didn't plant a field and expect crops the same day. You planted, and you tended, and you waited, and if you were patient and lucky and blessed, eventually something grew. The days that followed fell into a pattern, the comfortable rhythm of work and rest and work again that defined ranch life. Jonah rose before dawn each morning and was already halfway through the barn chores by the time Evelyn emerged from the house. She taught him to make bread, and he proved a surprisingly apt student, his soldier's discipline translating well to the precise measurements and patient kneading the dough required. They worked side by side on 100 small projects, patching the barn roof, replacing rotten boards in the chicken coop, cleaning out the root cellar, preparing for winter though it was still weeks away. And slowly, carefully, they began to talk. Not about the big things, not yet. Those truths required more trust than either of them had earned yet, but about small things. The weather, the horses' temperaments, the way the light hit the hills at sunset, books they'd read, though Jonah confessed he wasn't much of a reader and Evelyn admitted she'd read the same 6 books on her shelf so many times she had them memorized. On the 4th day, they rode out together to check on the small herd of cattle grazing in the far pasture, and Evelyn saw how naturally Jonah sat a horse, how easily he read the animal's moods and movements. He'd been born to this life, she realized. Whatever else the war and its aftermath had taken from him, it hadn't stolen his understanding of ranch work, his connection to animals and land and the cycles that govern both. On the 6th day, she caught him kneeling by her mother's grave on the hill, his hat in his hands, his lips moving silently. She didn't interrupt, but later when she asked him about it, he said simply, "I was thanking her for raising a daughter strong enough to take a chance on a broken man." On the 8th day, a storm rolled across the prairie. Nothing terrible, just a good soaking rain that the parched land needed desperately. They watched it come from the barn, where they'd taken shelter, standing in the open doorway and feeling the temperature drop as the clouds gathered. "I love storms," Evelyn said, watching the lightning fork across the darkening sky. "My father always said I was strange for it, but there's something about them that makes me feel alive. All that power, all that energy, just unleashed on the world with no apologies." "They used to terrify me," Jonah admitted. "During the war, we fought through a thunderstorm once. The noise, the confusion, the way you couldn't tell artillery from thunder. It was chaos. For years after, every storm would send me right back there. I'd have to find somewhere to hide, somewhere dark and small where I could wait it out. And now?" He was quiet for a moment, watching the rain begin to fall, first in scattered drops and then in sheets. "Now I'm trying to remember that not every loud noise means danger. That sometimes thunder is just thunder, and rain is just rain, and I'm safe here in this barn in Dakota territory, not trapped in some muddy field with death falling from the sky." Without thinking, Evelyn reached out and took his hand. His fingers were rough, calloused, trembling slightly the way they always did when he was stressed or tired. But he didn't pull away. He just stood there, holding her hand, watching the storm, and slowly, so slowly, she almost didn't notice, the trembling eased. They stood like that until the worst of the storm passed, hand in hand in the doorway of the barn. 2 people who barely knew each other, but were learning, slowly, what it meant to not be alone. That night, she heard him cry out from the barn again, but this time the sound was shorter, less desperate. And in the morning when she saw him, his eyes were clearer than ever, as if something inside him had finally started to heal. The townsfolk noticed the changes too. When Evelyn drove the wagon to Hollow Creek for supplies on the 10th day, with Jonah quiet beside her, she felt the weight of curious stares and heard the whispers that followed them through the mercantile. Mrs. Patterson, who ran the store with her husband, made a point of introducing herself to Jonah, looking him up and down with the frank assessment of a woman who'd seen everything twice and wasn't about to be fooled by appearances. "So you're the husband," Mrs. Patterson said, crossing her arms over her ample bosom. "Evelyn tells me you're working out well." "I'm doing my best, ma'am." Jonah's voice was polite but distant, the way it got when he was uncomfortable around strangers. "See that you do." Mrs. Patterson's eyes were sharp but not unkind. "That girl's been through enough without taking on a man who'll cause her more trouble. But if you're treating her right and pulling your weight, then I suppose we'll all mind our own business and let you be." "I appreciate that, ma'am." After they left the mercantile, Evelyn couldn't help but laugh at the expression on Jonah's face. "Don't mind Mrs. Patterson. She's protective, but she means well. And she's right. This town looks after its own, which means they'll be watching you to make sure you're treating me properly." "Are you worried I'm not?" He looked genuinely concerned. "Not even a little." She climbed onto the wagon seat. "You've been nothing but respectful and hardworking. I couldn't ask for better help, or a better—" She paused, searching for the right word. Partner, he offered quietly. Partner, she agreed and smiled. Yes, that's exactly what you are. They drove home through the afternoon sunshine, the wagon loaded with flour and sugar and coffee and all the small necessities that kept a ranch running. And when they passed the spot where the road curved toward their property, Jonah was the one who said it first. Feels good. Coming home. I haven't felt that in a long time. Evelyn's heart squeezed tight. No, I don't imagine you have. But the past wasn't done with Jonah Pierce yet, wasn't ready to release its hold on a man who'd spent 20 years running from ghosts. That night, the dreams came back worse than ever. And this time Evelyn heard him shouting, not just once, but repeatedly, the desperate cries of someone trapped in a nightmare too vivid to escape. She climbed down from her loft, pulled a shawl over her nightgown, and went to the barn. The lantern was still burning where he'd forgotten to blow it out, casting wavering shadows across the walls. She climbed the ladder to the loft and found him thrashing in his blankets, his face twisted with terror, his hands clawing at something only he could see. Jonah. She knelt beside him, careful not to touch him yet, knowing that waking someone violently from a nightmare could end badly. Jonah, wake up. You're safe. You're in Dakota territory in the barn. It's Evelyn. You're safe. His eyes flew open, wild and unseeing, and for a moment she thought he didn't recognize her. Then focus returned slowly, reality reasserting itself, and he collapsed back against the blankets, breathing hard. I'm sorry, he gasped. God, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to wake you. You didn't wake me. I was already awake. The lie came easily, kindly. Do you want to talk about it? No. The answer was immediate, automatic. Then, after a long pause, yes, maybe. I don't know. She sat down properly, arranging her skirts, settling in. Take your time. I've got nowhere else to be. He sat up, scrubbing his hands over his face, and in the lantern light she could see he was shaking, not just his hands now, but his whole body, tremors running through him like earthquake aftershocks. It was the field. It's always the field. The battle that went wrong, the one where we lost 2/3 of our company in less than an hour. I can still smell the powder smoke, still hear the screaming. And in the dream, I'm trying to help the wounded, but there's too many of them, too much blood, and I can't save anyone. I just watch them die, over and over, and I can't do anything to stop it. Evelyn listened, her heart breaking for the boy he'd been, the young soldier who'd seen things no one should see. That must have been terrible. I'm so sorry you carry that. I was 15, his voice cracked. 15 years old, lying about my age to fight in a war I didn't understand, and they put a rifle in my hands and told me to kill or be killed. What did I know? I was a farm boy from Illinois who'd never been farther than the county fair, and suddenly I was watching my friends die in the mud, and there wasn't anything heroic or noble about it. It was just waste, just stupid, pointless waste. Oh, Jonah. Without thinking, she reached out and took his hand again, the way she had during the storm. You were a child. You shouldn't have been there at all. But I was there, and I can't undo it, can't forget it, can't make it stop mattering. He looked at her, and his eyes were wet. Do you understand now why I can't promise to stay? Why I keep thinking I should just leave before I drag you down with all this broken mess I'm carrying? I understand that you think you're broken, she said firmly. But I don't see broken when I look at you, Jonah. I see someone who survived something terrible and is doing his damnedest to keep surviving. That's not weakness. That's strength. It doesn't feel like strength. Strength never does. It feels like getting up every morning even when you don't want to. It feels like doing the work that needs doing even when you're exhausted. It feels like staying even when leaving would be easier. She squeezed his hand. You've been strong for 20 years, Jonah Pierce. You just didn't recognize it. He was quiet for a long time, staring at their joined hands as if trying to understand how they'd gotten there. Finally, he said, Why are you being so kind to me? You barely know me. I could be dangerous, untrustworthy, any number of terrible things. You could be, she agreed, but you're not. I can see that much, even if you can't. And I'm being kind because someone needs to be, and because you deserve it, and because... She paused, choosing her words carefully. Because I know what it's like to feel like you're carrying too much alone. After my father died, I spent months trying to hold everything together, convince everyone I was fine, that I could manage. But I wasn't fine, and I couldn't manage, and pretending otherwise was killing me by inches. So I sent out that advertisement because I needed help, yes, but also because I needed not to be alone anymore. And maybe you need that too. Maybe I do, he whispered. They sat together in the lantern light, in the hay-sweet darkness of the barn loft, two wounded people finding unexpected comfort in each other's presence. And when Evelyn finally climbed back down the ladder and returned to the house, she left the lantern burning low, a small light in the darkness, a beacon saying you're not alone, you're safe, you're home. In the morning, Jonah was already at work when she emerged from the house, and if his eyes were red and his movements more careful than usual, neither of them mentioned it. They just fell into the day's rhythm, working side by side, finding their way forward one task at a time. And on the hill overlooking the ranch, beneath the cottonwood tree, a hawk perched and watched the two humans below. Saw how they moved in tandem now, how the spaces between them had grown smaller, how something fragile and precious was beginning to take root in the stubborn Dakota soil. The healing had begun. Neither of them recognized it yet, but it had begun. The slow, patient work of mending what seemed irreparably broken. And if the process was painful and uncertain and marked with setbacks, well, so was every worthwhile thing that grew. The weeks rolled forward like a river finding its course, each day carving deeper grooves into the pattern of their shared life. September arrived with cooler mornings and the first hints of gold touching the cottonwood leaves, and with it came the urgent work of preparing for winter. There were vegetables to harvest from Evelyn's small garden, hay to cut and stack in the barn, firewood to split and cord against the coming cold. The days grew shorter, the work no less demanding, and through it all Jonah stayed, his presence becoming as much a part of the ranch as the fence posts he'd mended or the bread he'd learned to bake. But staying, Evelyn was learning, didn't mean the same thing as settled. Jonah still slept in the barn, still woke with nightmares more nights than not, still carried that careful tension in his shoulders that spoke of a man ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. He worked hard, spoke kindly, never gave her reason to doubt his commitment to the partnership they'd formed. Yet there remained a distance in him, a locked room she couldn't enter, and she wondered sometimes if he'd ever trust her, or himself, enough to open that door. On a morning when frost painted the grass silver and their breath steamed in the early air, they were working together in the barn when Jonah suddenly stopped mid-motion, hammer suspended above a loose board, his whole body gone rigid. "Jonah?" Evelyn set down her own tools, concerned by the sudden stillness. "What's wrong?" He didn't answer at first, just stood frozen, staring at nothing. Then, slowly, he lowered the hammer and turned to face her, and she saw something in his expression she'd never seen before. Not fear exactly, but something adjacent to it. Vulnerability, raw and unguarded. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice rough. "Something I should have told you before, but I was afraid if I did, you'd send me away." Her heart kicked hard against her ribs. "I'm listening." He set the hammer down carefully, as if it might shatter, and drew a long breath. "I told you I've been drifting since the war ended, that I've worked ranches from Montana to Wyoming, never staying long. What I didn't tell you was why I kept moving, why I couldn't stay." She waited, giving him space to find the words. "After the war, I came home to nothing. I told you that part. But what I didn't say was that I tried, really tried, to rebuild. Found work on a ranch in Missouri, worked there for 2 years, saved my money. Met a woman. Her name was Sarah. She was the rancher's daughter, and she was kind to me when I didn't know how to be kind to myself. We were going to get married. Her father was going to give us a section of land, help us build a house. I thought maybe I could have a normal life after all. Thought maybe the war would stop following me if I just pushed forward hard enough." Evelyn's chest tightened. She already knew this story wouldn't end well. One night, about a month before the wedding, I had one of the nightmares. The bad kind. I woke up shouting, thrashing, and Sarah was there trying to calm me down, and I didn't know where I was. Didn't recognize her. Thought she was the enemy. His voice broke. I almost hurt her. Came so close. My hands were around her throat before I realized what I was doing, before I understood it was her and not some fever dream from the battlefield. "Oh, Jonah." Evelyn's hand went to her own throat, feeling the phantom pressure of fingers that had never touched her. She screamed. Her father came running. They pulled me off her, held me down until I stopped fighting, until I remembered who I was and where I was and what I'd almost done. He was shaking now, the tremor that lived in his hands spreading through his whole frame. She broke off the engagement the next day, couldn't even look at me. Her father paid me what I was owed and told me to leave before sundown. Said if I ever came back, he'd shoot me on sight, and I'd deserve it. You wouldn't have hurt her, Evelyn said, though her voice wavered. You stopped. You recognized her and stopped. But I almost didn't, that's the point. And that was 12 years ago, and I've never let anyone close enough since then to risk it happening again. Never slept under the same roof as another person. Never stayed in one place long enough to form attachments. Because I'm dangerous, Evelyn. Not by choice, not on purpose, but dangerous all the same. And you deserve to know that before we... He couldn't seem to finish the sentence. The barn was very quiet. Outside, a crow called harshly, and one of the horses stamped in its stall. Evelyn stood still, processing everything he'd told her, feeling the weight of his confession settle over them both like ash after a fire. Why are you telling me this now? She asked finally. Because I'm getting comfortable here. The admission seemed to cost him something. Because I'm starting to sleep through the night more often than not. Because yesterday I caught myself thinking about next spring's planting, and I realized I was assuming I'd still be here to see it. And that terrifies me, because what if I hurt you? What if one night I wake up confused and you're there trying to help, and I do something unforgivable? What if you don't? She moved closer to him, slowly, giving him time to step back if he needed to. What if the nightmares are getting better because you're healing? What if you've carried this fear for 12 years based on one terrible moment when you were half asleep and traumatized, and you've let it convince you that you're a monster when you're not? You can't know that. No, she agreed. I can't promise you'll never have another nightmare, never wake up confused. But I can tell you this, I'm not afraid of you, Jonah Pierce. I've watched you for weeks now. I've seen how gentle you are with the horses, how careful you are around me, how you apologize when you accidentally bump into me in the kitchen. Whatever happened 12 years ago, it doesn't define who you are now. Sarah was afraid of me. Her father thought I was dangerous. They weren't wrong to feel that way. They were afraid because they didn't understand, because they saw one moment and judged you entirely by it. Evelyn reached out and took both his hands, feeling them tremble in her grasp. I'm not Sarah, and this isn't Missouri. I know what I'm choosing. I know the risks. And I'm telling you right now that I trust you. His eyes searched hers, desperate and disbelieving. How can you trust me when I don't trust myself? Because someone has to start. She squeezed his hands. Because trust isn't about certainty. It's about choosing to believe in someone despite the uncertainty. And I choose to believe in you. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then slowly, Jonah pulled his hands free and stepped back, and Evelyn's heart sank, thinking she'd pushed too hard, offered too much, scared him away with her declaration. But he didn't leave. He just stood there, arms wrapped around himself as if trying to hold his own pieces together, and said quietly, I don't know how to accept that. Don't know how to believe I deserve it. Then don't believe it yet. Just don't run away from it either. She kept her voice gentle. Stay, keep working, keep healing. And when you're ready, if you're ever ready, we'll figure out what comes next, together. And if I'm never ready, then we stay partners. We work the ranch together, share the load, and you sleep in the barn for the rest of your days if that's what you need. I won't force anything, Jonah. I just won't turn you away because of things you can't control. He nodded slowly, something easing in his posture. You're a remarkable woman, Evelyn Hart. I'm a practical woman who needs help with her ranch and who's gotten used to having you around. She smiled slightly. Now pick up that hammer and help me finish this repair before the day gets away from us. They returned to work, but something had shifted between them. The locked room hadn't opened, not entirely, but the door had cracked, letting in the first sliver of light. And as they worked side by side through the morning, Evelyn thought about trust and risk and the strange courage it took to let someone carry their damage into your life and believe it wouldn't destroy you both. That evening, as the sun painted the western sky in shades of amber and rose, they stood together in the doorway of the barn and watched the day end. It had become a habit between them, These quiet moments of observation, finding peace in the simple act of watching the world turn from light to dark. My father used to say that sunsets were God's way of reminding us that endings could be beautiful too, Evelyn said softly. He'd stand right here in this exact spot every evening after the work was done and just watch the light fade. Said it helped him remember that there was more to life than labor. He sounds like a wise man. He was, though he had his troubles too. My mother's death nearly broke him. For a whole year after she passed, he barely spoke. Just worked from dawn to dusk, ate whatever I managed to cook, and sat by her grave until after dark every night. I was 12 years old, and I thought I'd lost both my parents even though he was still breathing. What brought him back? Time, mostly, and stubbornness. One morning he woke up and decided he owed it to her memory to keep living, really living, not just surviving. So he started telling stories again, teaching me things, planning for the future. The grief never left him entirely. I don't think that kind of loss ever does, but he learned to carry it without letting it crush him. Jonah was quiet for a long moment. Do you think that's possible? Learning to carry the weight without being crushed? I think it's the only way forward. She glanced at him. The alternative is letting the weight bury you, and neither of us wants that. No, he agreed softly. Neither of us wants that. They stood together as the last light faded and the first stars emerged, and when they finally parted for the night, she to the house, he to the barn, Evelyn felt something settle in her chest that might have been hope, or might have been determination, or might have been the simple recognition that healing was never a straight line. It curved and doubled back on itself, took detours through dark places, required patience and faith, and the willingness to keep moving even when the destination remained uncertain. The next morning brought visitors. Evelyn was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard the wagon approaching, and when she looked up, she recognized Mrs. Patterson from the Mercantile along with two other women from Hollow Creek, Emma Sullivan, the school teacher, and Ruth Morrison, whose husband ran the feed store. "Morning, Evelyn," Mrs. Patterson called out cheerfully as the wagon pulled into the yard. "Hope we're not intruding, but we thought it was high time we paid a proper visit and met your husband officially." Evelyn wiped her hands on her apron, fighting down a flutter of nervousness. She'd known this was coming. In a small town, a mail-order husband was news, and the women would want to assess him, make sure he was treating her right, satisfy their curiosity about the man who'd stepped off the train looking half dead, and somehow convinced Evelyn Hart to take him on. "You're not intruding," she lied politely. "Come on in. I'll make coffee." Jonah emerged from the barn, no doubt drawn by the sound of unfamiliar voices, and Evelyn saw him tense as he took in the wagon full of women. She caught his eye and gave him a small nod that she hoped conveyed both reassurance and apology. He approached slowly, removing his hat, his expression carefully neutral. "Ladies," he said with a slight nod. "Morning." "Mr. Pierce." "Mrs." Patterson climbed down from the wagon with surprising agility for a woman of her size and years. "We've come to welcome you properly to Hollow Creek. It's past time we got to know you better." The next hour was an exercise in polite interrogation disguised as neighborly conversation. The women settled themselves in Evelyn's kitchen, the house suddenly feeling far too small, and proceeded to ask Jonah questions while ostensibly drinking coffee and admiring Evelyn's preserves. Where was he from? What had he done before coming to Dakota? Did he have family? What were his intentions regarding the ranch? Regarding Evelyn? To his credit, Jonah answered with patient courtesy, revealing just enough to satisfy curiosity without giving away anything too personal. He spoke of his Illinois childhood, his work on various ranches, his appreciation for the land and the work it required. He was respectful toward Evelyn, referring to her as Miss Hart, despite Mrs. Patterson's pointed comments about how unusual it was for a married couple to maintain such formality. "We haven't had the official ceremony yet," Evelyn interjected smoothly when Mrs. Patterson's hints became too pointed to ignore. "We're waiting until we're both sure of the arrangement. Seem more sensible than rushing into something we might regret." "Sensible," Emma Sullivan repeated thoughtfully. The schoolteacher was younger than the other two women, only a few years older than Evelyn, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. That's one word for it. Some might say unconventional. I've never much cared for convention, Evelyn said firmly. My father taught me to do what worked, not what looked proper. This works for us. As long as it does work, Ruth Morrison said, her tone gentler than Mrs. Patterson's or Emma's. She was a soft-spoken woman who'd buried 2 children and knew something about grief. We just want to make sure you're being treated well, Evelyn. You've been through enough without taking on troubles you don't need. I appreciate your concern, truly. Evelyn refilled their coffee cups. But Jonah's been nothing but respectful and hardworking. He's earned his place here. The women exchanged glances that spoke volumes about what they thought of a man earning his place in a woman's home, but they didn't push further. Instead, they shifted to town gossip. Who was courting whom? Whose crops had failed? Which businesses were thriving or struggling? Jonah excused himself after a few minutes, claiming he needed to check on the cattle in the far pasture, and Evelyn envied him his escape. After the women finally left, loaded with a basket of tomatoes from Evelyn's garden and promises to visit again soon, Evelyn found Jonah in the barn, brushing down one of the horses with more attention than the task required. I'm sorry about that, she said without preamble. They mean well, but they can be a bit much. They care about you. That's not a bad thing. He continued his steady strokes along the horse's flank. They think I'm not good enough for you. They think no one's good enough for me. Mrs. Patterson's been trying to marry me off for 3 years to various unsuitable men, and when none of them worked out, she decided I was too particular. Now she's convinced you're hiding something terrible, and she's appointed herself your personal investigator. She's not wrong about the hiding something terrible part. She's wrong about everything that matters. Evelyn leaned against the stall door. You handled them well. That couldn't have been easy being interrogated like that. I've survived worse interrogations. He moved to the horse's other side. But I appreciate you defending me. Not everyone would. Partners defend each other. That's how it works. He glanced at her over the horse's back, and something in his expression made her breath catch. Is that what we are? Really? Partners? What else would we be? I don't know. He set the brush aside and came around the horse to stand in front of her. But I'm starting to think maybe we're more than that, or could be if I wasn't so... He stopped, searching for words. Afraid, she supplied gently. Broken, he corrected. If I wasn't so broken. Jonah Pierce, you listen to me. She straightened, meeting his eyes directly. You are not broken. You're healing. There's a difference. Broken things can't be fixed. Healing things just need time and care and the right conditions. You're healing. I can see it happening, even if you can't. What if you're wrong? Then I'm wrong. But I don't think I am. She reached out and touched his arm, feeling the tension in his muscles. I've seen broken, Jonah. I watched my father break after my mother died, and I've seen healing too. Watched him slowly come back to himself piece by piece. You're doing the same thing. Some days are harder than others, but you're moving forward. That counts for something. He covered her hand with his own, the tremor barely noticeable now. You make me want to believe that. Then believe it. Or at least don't argue with me about it. She smiled. I'm stubborn, you know. Once I make up my mind about something, I don't change it easily. I've noticed. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. Not quite a smile, but close. You decided I was worth keeping pretty quickly, didn't you? The moment you started working without being asked, that told me everything I needed to know about your character. They stood there in the quiet barn, hands touching, something fragile and precious building between them, like the first ice forming on a winter pond. Beautiful, but not quite solid enough to trust your weight to yet. And when they finally separated and returned to their work, they did so with a new awareness of each other, a recognition that they were approaching something significant, even if neither of them could name it yet. That night, for the first time since his arrival, Jonah didn't have nightmares. Or if he did, they were quiet ones, the kind that let him sleep through until morning. When Evelyn woke to the sound of him already at work in the barn, moving the horses to pasture for the day, she felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized was tight. The weeks continued to pass, each one bringing them deeper into autumn and closer to winter. They worked side by side through harvesting the last of the garden, through cutting and stacking firewood, through all the endless preparations required to survive a Dakota winter. The aspens turned gold on the hillsides, and the cottonwoods followed, and the air grew sharp with the promise of frost and snow. And through it all, they talked. Not always about important things, sometimes just about the work, or the weather, or stories from their separate pasts that didn't carry too much weight. But gradually, carefully, they began to share the harder truths too. Evelyn told him about Thomas Brennan, the banker's son who'd courted her for 6 months before deciding a ranchwoman wasn't quite respectable enough for his family's standing. Told him how that rejection had felt like confirmation of everything she'd feared about herself, that she was too independent, too weathered by hard work, too much herself to be lovable. Jonah listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he said quietly, "His loss, and his mistake. Any man who couldn't see your worth wasn't looking properly." "You have to say that. We're partners." "I don't have to say anything, but I mean it. You're strong and capable and honest, and those are rare qualities. Anyone who wants you to be less than you are doesn't deserve you." She felt heat rise in her cheeks and changed the subject quickly. Uncomfortable with praise she didn't know how to accept. But later, lying awake in her loft, she thought about his words and felt something warm unfold in her chest. When was the last time someone had called her strong and meant it as a compliment rather than a criticism? When had anyone looked at her independence and seen value instead of deficiency? Jonah shared his own stories too, in pieces. Told her about his sister, Margaret, who'd written him letters for years after the war until they'd finally lost touch entirely. About the friends he'd made and lost in battle, boys who'd laughed and dreamed and died before they'd really learned how to live. About the ranches he'd worked and the men who'd employed him, some kind and some cruel. All of them temporary, because he'd never let himself stay long enough to become permanent. "I don't even know if Margaret's still alive," he said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge. "Last letter I got from her was 8 years ago. She was living in Kansas City with her husband and 2 children. I meant to write back, but I was moving around so much, and I didn't know where I'd be by the time her response could reach me, so I just didn't. And now I don't know how to find her, or if she'd want to hear from me after all this time." "You could try," Evelyn suggested gently. "Write to the last address you had. Someone there might know where she moved, or at least be able to pass a message along. And say what? Sorry I abandoned you for 20 years, but I was too broken to be someone's brother? Say you're thinking of her. Say you hope she's well. Say you'd like to reconnect if she's willing. It doesn't have to be complicated, Jonah. Sometimes simple honesty is enough." He was quiet for a long time, considering. "Maybe I will. When winter comes and there's less outdoor work, maybe I'll write her, try to find her again. I think that would be good. Family's important, especially when you've been apart from them. Did you have any siblings?" "No. My mother died giving birth to me. The doctor said there were complications, that she shouldn't have tried, but my father said she wanted a child more than anything, wanted to give him a family. I think he resented me for a long time after she died, though he tried not to show it. Tried to be a good father despite everything." "That must have been hard, growing up knowing you cost someone their life." "It was." She pulled her shawl tighter against the evening chill. "But my father told me once, when I was about 14 and going through a particularly dark spell, that my mother made her choice knowingly, that she knew the risks and chose me anyway, chose the possibility of me. And that was a gift I should honor by living fully, by not wasting the life she gave me on guilt and regret." "Wise man," Jonah said again, his voice soft with respect. He had his moments. They sat together as the night deepened and the temperature dropped, neither wanting to break the spell of companionship that wrapped around them like a warm blanket. And when they finally did part for the night, Evelyn found herself thinking that these quiet conversations, this easy sharing of space and stories, this was what she'd been missing. Not romance, not passion, but simple companionship. Someone to talk to as the day ended. Someone who listened without judgment and shared his own truths in return. It was enough. More than enough. October arrived with a cold snap that warned of the winter to come, and with it came the first real test of everything they'd been building. The cattle, which had been grazing peacefully in the far pasture for weeks, suddenly scattered during a windstorm, breaking through a weak section of fence and heading toward the open prairie. Evelyn and Jonah spent 2 full days rounding them up, working from before dawn until well after dark, sleeping in shifts under the stars with only their bedrolls and the fire for comfort. It was exhausting work, the kind that tested every bit of strength and skill they possessed. But they worked together with the synchronicity of people who'd learned each other's rhythms, anticipating moves and covering gaps without needing to discuss strategy. And when they finally drove the last stubborn heifer back through the repaired fence and secured it properly, they stood together in the pasture, covered in dust and sweat despite the cold, and just looked at each other. "We did it," Evelyn said, almost surprised. "We did." Jonah was grinning, actually grinning, his whole face transformed by genuine joy. God, that was harder than it should have been. That one cow with the crooked horn, she was determined to make our lives difficult. She's always been stubborn. My father named her Contrary because she does the opposite of whatever you want. Evelyn started laughing, the kind of exhausted, slightly hysterical laughter that came after days of tension finally released. "I can't believe we got them all back. I thought for sure we'd lost at least 3 or 4 to the prairie." "Not on my watch." He was laughing too now, caught up in her mirth and relief. "I've chased cattle across half the Western Territories. Takes more than a windstorm and some ornery cows to beat me." They stood there in the pasture, laughing like fools, and Evelyn realized this was the first time she'd heard him really laugh. Not a quiet chuckle or a slight smile, but genuine, full-throated laughter. It transformed him, made him look younger, almost carefree, made her see the boy he must have been before the war took that lightness away. "Come on," she said when they'd finally caught their breath. "Let's go home. I'll make something hot for supper and we can sleep in actual beds instead of on the ground. Best offer I've had all week." They rode back to the ranch through the late afternoon light, tired but satisfied. And when they finally dismounted in the yard and tended to the horses, Evelyn caught Jonah looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. "Nothing. Just thinking how this feels different than other places I've worked. Other ranches." "Different how?" He seemed to struggle for words. "Like I'm not just working for someone. Like it matters to me whether we succeed or fail. Like it's mine too somehow, even though it's not." "It could be," she heard herself say before she'd fully thought it through. "Legally, I mean. If we went through with the marriage ceremony, it would be as much yours as mine. That's how these things work." He stared at her. "Is that what you want?" "I don't know." She was being honest, feeling her way through the conversation as carefully as she'd track across thin ice. "But I know I like having you here. I know we work well together. And I know that whatever this arrangement is, it feels more real than any conventional marriage I've seen in town. So maybe we should make it official. Or maybe we shouldn't. I honestly don't know what the right answer is." "Neither do I." He was still watching her with that unreadable expression. "But I'm not opposed to it. To making it legal, I mean, if that's what you eventually decide you want." "I'll think about it," she said. "We both will. And when we're ready, if we're ever ready, we'll talk about it again." "Fair enough." They parted then, she to the house, and he to the barn. But something had shifted again. Another door cracked open just a little wider. And as Evelyn prepared supper with hands that ached from 2 days of hard work, she found herself imagining what it might mean to really marry Jonah Pierce. Not just a legal arrangement, not just a partnership for survival, but a genuine commitment. A choice to build something together, knowing all the risks and damages they both carried. It was a terrifying thought, but not as terrifying as going back to the loneliness she'd felt before he arrived. Outside, the sun set in a blaze of orange and purple, and the first stars emerged in the darkening sky. Winter was coming, bringing its own challenges and demands. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, Evelyn Hart faced the approaching season without dread. Whatever came, she wouldn't face it alone. And that made all the difference. The night following their cattle roundup, Evelyn woke to a sound that froze her blood. Not Jonah's usual nightmare cries, distant and muffled from the barn, but something closer, much closer. Footsteps on the porch, the creak of a floorboard, and then, unmistakably, the sound of her door handle turning. She sat bolt upright in her loft, heart hammering, reaching instinctively for the rifle her father had always kept beside his bed. Her fingers closed around cold metal just as she heard Jonah's voice, rough with sleep and confusion, calling from below. "Evelyn? Are you there? I don't know where." She understood instantly. He was sleepwalking, caught in some nightmare, his mind somewhere between the battlefield and the present. She set the rifle down carefully and descended the ladder, moving slowly, speaking softly. "Jonah, I'm here. You're safe. You're at the ranch in Dakota territory. Do you hear me?" He stood in the middle of her main room, still as a statue, his eyes open but unseeing. In the dim light from the banked fire, she could see he was trembling, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He'd come in his nightshirt and bare feet, oblivious to the cold that had him shivering. "They're dying," he whispered, his voice broken. "I have to help them. Have to find them. Can't let them die alone in the mud." "They're not there anymore." Evelyn approached him carefully, the way she'd approach a spooked horse. "The war is over. It's been over for 22 years. You're home now. You're safe." "Not home. Never home. Home burned. Home's gone." His eyes were still distant, still seeing horrors she couldn't imagine. "Everyone's gone. I'm here." She reached out slowly, carefully, and touched his arm. He flinched but didn't pull away. "I'm here, and you're in my house, where you're welcome, where you're safe." "Can you hear my voice, Jonah? Can you follow it back?" For a long, terrible moment, he didn't respond. Then gradually, focus returned to his eyes. He looked down at her hand on his arm, then at her face, then around the room as if seeing it for the first time. Understanding dawned, followed immediately by horror. "Oh God!" He jerked away from her touch, stumbling backward. Did I hurt you?" "No, you walked in calling for me, and I came down. You haven't hurt anyone, Jonah. You're safe, and so am I. I was asleep. I don't remember." He looked down at his bare feet, at the nightshirt, at the door standing open behind him, letting in the October cold. "Jesus, I could have done anything. Could have hurt you, could have... This is what I was afraid of. This is exactly what I told you about. And I'm telling you nothing happened." She moved to close the door, shutting out the cold and the darkness. "You were confused and looking for help. That's all. You didn't threaten me, didn't come at me. You just walked in and called my name. This time." His voice was ragged with fear and shame. "But what about next time? What if next time I think you're the enemy? What if I do to you what I almost did to Sarah?" "You won't. You can't know that." "No," she agreed, her voice calm despite the way her heart was still racing. "I can't know it with certainty. But I know you, Jonah Pierce. I know how careful you are around me, how conscious you are of your own strength. I know you'd cut off your own hands before you'd willingly hurt me. And I trust that even in your sleep, even in your nightmares, some part of you knows the difference between enemy and friend." That's not enough. He was shaking harder now, whether from cold or emotion she couldn't tell. Trust isn't enough when instincts take over. When you're back in that place where everything is threat and survival. "I should leave. Right now. Before something worse happens." "You're not leaving." She spoke firmly, the same tone she used with spooked horses or stubborn cattle. "Not tonight. Not in this state. You're going to sit down by this fire, and I'm going to make tea, and we're going to talk about this like rational adults, instead of letting fear make decisions for us." "Evelyn, sit down, Jonah." He sat, more from shock at her tone than from agreement, sinking into one of the rocking chairs by the hearth. She stirred up the fire, added more wood, set water to boil for tea. Her hands were steadier than she'd expected, though inside she was a churning mess of fear and determination and something else she didn't want to examine too closely. When the tea was ready, she handed him a cup and took the other chair, drawing her nightgown and robe more tightly around herself. They sat in silence for a few minutes, drinking the hot liquid, letting its warmth seep into cold bones and frightened hearts. "Tell me about the nightmare," she said finally. "What were you seeing?" "The field. It's always the field. But tonight it was worse. I was trying to find the wounded, trying to help them, but I couldn't see through the smoke. Couldn't hear their voices over the cannon fire. And I kept thinking if I could just find them, just get to them, I could save them. But I was lost. completely lost. And then I heard you calling me, and I thought you were there, on the battlefield, and I had to find you before—" He stopped, his hands clenching around the cup. "That's when I woke up here. I'm not on any battlefield. I'm right here, safe and whole." She leaned forward slightly. "Listen to me. What happened tonight was frightening. I won't pretend it wasn't. But it wasn't dangerous. You were confused and seeking help, not looking to harm anyone. Do you understand the difference?" Sarah's father didn't think there was a difference. Sarah's father was protecting his daughter. I respect that. But he didn't know you the way I do. Didn't see how hard you work to control yourself, how aware you are of your own triggers. She set her cup aside. "Here's what I propose. You move into the house, into the small room downstairs that I've been using for storage. We'll clean it out, put a proper bed in there, make it comfortable. That way, if you have nightmares, you won't have to cross the yard in the cold, and I'll be close enough to help bring you back if needed." "Absolutely not." His refusal was immediate, vehement. "That's even more dangerous than what happened tonight. At least when I'm in the barn, there's distance between us." "And that distance helped how exactly? You still ended up here, still ended up confused and frightened." She met his eyes directly. "I understand you're afraid. I even understand why. But isolating yourself isn't working, Jonah. The nightmares are part of you, and hiding from them isn't making them go away. Maybe facing them with help nearby, is what you need. Or maybe it's exactly what will lead to disaster. Maybe, but I'm willing to take that risk. I'm not willing to let you take it." They stared at each other across the firelight, both stubborn, both convinced they were right, neither willing to yield. Finally, Evelyn sighed and shifted tactics. "Fine, you stay in the barn for now, but we install a bell. I'll put one by my bed, and you'll have one in the loft. If you wake from a nightmare and you're confused, ring the bell. I'll come to you, or you'll come here, but either way, we'll both know what's happening. We'll have a signal, a plan. Better than stumbling across the yard in the dark with no warning." He was quiet for a long moment, considering. "A bell, that could work. It will work. We'll make it work." She picked up her tea again. "Now drink your tea before it gets cold, and then you're sleeping on that sofa there for the rest of the night. I'm not letting you walk back to the barn at this hour, and I'm certainly not letting you go back there while you're still shaken. We can argue about long-term arrangements tomorrow, but tonight you're staying here where I can keep an eye on you." "Evelyn, I don't care what you think. I care about what's practical and safe, and right now, that's you sleeping by a warm fire instead of out in the cold barn while you're still upset." Her voice softened slightly. "Please, Jonah, let me do this much. Let me take care of you the way you've been taking care of this ranch." He looked like he wanted to argue further, but exhaustion was written in every line of his body, and the fire was warm, and maybe some part of him was tired of fighting his own fear. "Just for tonight. Just for tonight," she agreed, though she had no intention of letting him return to the barn the next day if she could help it. She found blankets and a pillow, made him as comfortable as possible on the sofa, and returned to her loft. But she didn't sleep. She lay awake listening to him breathe, listening to him shift restlessly, listening for any sign that the nightmares were returning. Twice she heard him murmur something in his sleep, words she couldn't make out. But he didn't cry out, didn't rise, didn't fall back into that terrible half-waking state that had brought him to her door. When dawn finally broke, painting the sky pale gold, she descended to find him already awake, sitting up on the sofa and staring at the cold ashes in the fireplace. "Morning," she said quietly. "Coffee?" "Please." His voice was hoarse, tired. "I'm sorry about last night, about all of it. Nothing to apologize for. It happened, we dealt with it, and now we move forward." She busied herself with starting the fire and making coffee, grateful for the familiar tasks. "I'm going into town today. We need supplies, and I want to pick up a couple of bells from the mercantile. You can come with me or stay here, whichever you prefer." "I'll come. Need to face people eventually, and putting it off won't make it easier." They made the trip to Hollow Creek in the wagon, the morning cold but clear, the sky that brilliant blue that only autumn could produce. The town was quiet when they arrived, just a few people moving about their business. At the Mercantile, Mrs. Patterson looked up from her counter and immediately zeroed in on Jonah's haggard appearance. "You look terrible," she said bluntly. "What happened?" "Rough night," Jonah answered before Evelyn could. "Cattle got out again. We spent half the night securing the fence." The lie came smoothly, naturally, and Mrs. Patterson accepted it without question. "Well, you need better fencing then. James Morrison at the feed store has some new wire in, stronger than what most folks are using. Might be worth investing in before winter hits hard." "We'll look into it," Evelyn said, grateful for the practical turn in conversation. "Right now, I need 2 bells. The kind you can ring from bed. Good loud ones." Mrs. Patterson raised an eyebrow but retrieved the items without comment. "Anything else?" They gathered their supplies, coffee, sugar, flour, lamp oil, and loaded everything into the wagon. As they were preparing to leave, they ran into Reverend Thomas standing outside the church. "Miss Hart, Mr. Pierce." The elderly minister nodded to them both. "Good to see you. I was hoping you might stop by. I've been meaning to speak with you both about making your arrangement official. Legal, I mean." Evelyn felt Jonah tense beside her. "We've been discussing it, Reverend. Haven't quite decided yet." "Well, when you do decide, you know where to find me. I don't judge how folks choose to live, but I do think there's value in legal recognition. Protection for you both, especially you, Miss Hart, should anything happen." The Reverend's eyes were kind but serious. "Just think about it. That's all I ask." "We will," Jonah said quietly. "Thank you, Reverend." They drove home in silence, both lost in their own thoughts. The conversation with the Reverend had raised questions neither of them was quite ready to answer. What were they to each other? Partners? Yes. Friends, increasingly. But husband and wife? That felt both too simple and too complicated to define what had grown between them. Back at the ranch, they installed the bells as planned. One by Evelyn's bed in the loft, one in Jonah's space in the barn, the ropes running through carefully positioned pulleys so that ringing one would ring the other. It was a simple system, but it gave them both a sense of security, a way to communicate across the distance that Jonah still insisted on maintaining. That night, Evelyn lay awake again, listening for the bell that didn't ring. The next night, the same. On the third night, exhausted from 3 days of broken sleep, she finally fell into deep slumber and didn't wake until dawn. The days shortened as October gave way to November, and with the changing season came the first real snow. Not much, just a dusting that melted by noon, but enough to remind them that winter was no longer a distant threat but an approaching reality. They worked with increased urgency now, finishing the last of the winterization tasks, making sure every gap was sealed and every supply was stocked. And through it all, the bell remained silent. Jonah's nightmares seemed to have quieted, whether because of the bell's presence or because something in him was genuinely healing, Evelyn couldn't say. But he seemed different, calmer, more present. He laughed more often, spoke more freely, carried himself with less of that tense readiness to flee that had marked his first weeks on the ranch. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the early snow, he said suddenly, "I wrote to Margaret, my sister. Sent the letter yesterday when I rode to town for those fence supplies." Evelyn turned to him, surprised and pleased. "That's wonderful. What did you say?" "The truth, that I've been a poor brother, that I've thought about her often, despite my silence, that I'd like to reconnect if she's willing, that I'm in Dakota territory now, working a ranch, and that I think I might finally be in a place where I can stay." He paused. "That I've met someone who makes staying feel possible." Her breath caught. "You told her about me?" "Not in detail, just that I'm working for a woman who's given me a chance when I didn't deserve one, and that I'm grateful for it." He looked at her sideways. "Was that wrong, to mention you?" "No, not wrong." She felt warmth spread through her chest despite the cold air. "I'm glad you told her, and I hope she writes back. Then, if she does, it won't be quick. Could be months before a letter finds her and she responds. If she responds at all. She will. Sisters don't forget their brothers, no matter how much time has passed." They sat together as the last light faded, and Evelyn found herself thinking about family, about connection, about all the ways people could be bound to each other beyond blood. She and Jonah weren't family by any traditional definition, but they'd become something to each other, something that mattered, and maybe that was enough. The next afternoon brought visitors again, but this time it was just Emma Sullivan, the schoolteacher, arriving on horseback with an urgent expression. "Evelyn, I need help." Emma dismounted quickly. "There's a family, the Johnsons, just moved into that abandoned homestead 5 miles west of town. They've got 3 children, and the youngest is sick, very sick. Mrs. Johnson sent word asking if anyone knew healing, and Mrs. Patterson said you might be able to help." "I'm not a doctor," Evelyn protested. "I just know some of what my mother taught me and what I learned taking care of my father." "That's more than they have right now. Please, Evelyn. The child is burning with fever, and they don't have money for the doctor in Bismarck." Evelyn looked at Jonah, who nodded immediately. "Go. I'll handle things here. Take whatever supplies you need." She gathered her mother's medicine bag, herbs, tinctures, clean cloth, and rode out with Emma through the cold afternoon. The Johnson homestead was rough, barely more than a soddy with a leaking roof and gaps in the walls. Inside, she found exactly what she'd feared: a child no more than 4 years old, burning with fever, her breathing labored and wet. "How long has she been like this?" Evelyn asked Mrs. Johnson, a worn woman who looked older than her years. 3 days. Started with a cough, but it got worse. Now she barely wakes, and when she does, she doesn't know where she is." Evelyn examined the child as best she could with her limited knowledge. The symptoms looked like pneumonia, which meant the child needed warmth, fluids, and medicine she didn't have. But she did what she could, made poultices for the chest, mixed feverfew tea, showed Mrs. Johnson how to keep the child's temperature down with cool cloths. "She needs to see a real doctor," Evelyn said honestly. "I've done what I can, but this is beyond my skill." "We can't afford a doctor." Mr. Johnson spoke from the corner, his voice defeated. "Spent everything we had getting here, getting this place. If she dies—" His voice broke. "She's not going to die." Evelyn said it with more confidence than she felt. "Keep doing what I showed you. Keep her warm but not too hot. Get fluids into her whenever she wakes. And send word tomorrow. Let me know how she's doing. If she's not better, we'll figure out how to get the doctor here, money or not." She stayed until evening, teaching Mrs. Johnson everything she knew about nursing the sick, and rode home through the darkness with Emma beside her, both of them quiet with worry. Jonah was waiting when she arrived, a lamp burning in the window to guide her home. He took her horse without a word, and when she finally came into the house, he had hot soup ready and a fire blazing. "How was the child?" he asked. "Bad, very bad. I did what I could, but I'm not sure it will be enough." She sank into a chair, exhausted and discouraged. "They can't afford a doctor, and I don't have the skills to save her if it's truly pneumonia." "Then we'll pay for the doctor." She looked up at him, startled. "Jonah, we don't have that kind of money to spare. We have enough. And if we don't, we'll find it. You can't let a child die because her parents are poor." His voice was firm, decided. "Tomorrow, I'll ride to Bismarck and bring back the doctor. Whatever it costs, we'll manage." Tears pricked at her eyes, surprising her with their sudden intensity. That's incredibly kind of you." "It's the right thing to do, and maybe—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Maybe I've spent too many years watching people suffer and doing nothing because it wasn't my problem. Maybe it's time I stopped running from responsibility and started taking some on." The next morning, true to his word, Jonah rode out before dawn. He returned late that afternoon with a tired doctor who carried his bag with the weary competence of someone who'd seen too much suffering. They rode immediately to the Johnson homestead, and Evelyn went with them, unable to stay behind wondering. The doctor examined the child, administered medicines from his bag, and gave instructions that were more detailed and specific than anything Evelyn could have offered. "She'll need careful watching for the next few days," he said. "But if the fever breaks by tomorrow, she should recover. You did well with the initial treatment," he added to Evelyn. "Likely kept her alive long enough for me to help." When the doctor quoted his fee, Mr. Johnson's face fell, but Jonah stepped forward before the man could speak. "I'll cover it. Consider it a neighborly gesture." "I can't let you "You're not letting me do anything. I'm choosing to do it. Accept it with grace and pay it forward someday when you're able." The ride home was quiet. all three of them exhausted from the long day and the emotional weight of dealing with life and death matters. But when they finally reached the ranch and the doctor had continued on to town, Evelyn turned to Jonah in the barn and said simply, "Thank you. What you did today, that was extraordinary. It was necessary. There's a difference." "No, there isn't. Not when necessity requires that kind of generosity." She stepped closer to him. "You're a good man, Jonah Pierce. I hope you're starting to believe that about yourself." He looked at her for a long moment, and in the lamplight she saw something shift in his expression, something that looked like hope beginning to overcome fear. "I'm starting to. Slowly. Because of you. Not because of me, because of who you actually are underneath all that fear and guilt you've been carrying." She reached up and touched his face gently, feeling stubble rough against her palm. "The war didn't break you, Jonah. It tried to, but it didn't succeed. You're still here, still fighting, still becoming someone worth knowing." He covered her hand with his own, holding it against his cheek. "Evelyn, Whatever he was going to say was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats approaching fast. They both turned as a rider came into the yard, and Evelyn recognized James Morrison from the feed store. "Evelyn! Jonah! The Johnson child, the fever broke an hour ago. The doctor says she's going to be fine. Wanted you to know right away." Relief flooded through her so intensely she felt dizzy. "Thank God. Oh, thank God." After Morrison left, she and Jonah stood in the barn, neither quite knowing what to say. The moment between them had been broken, but the feeling lingered, something important almost spoken, almost acknowledged. "We should get some sleep," Jonah said finally. "It's been a long day." "It has." But she didn't move, didn't turn away. "Jonah? What you were about to say before we were interrupted." He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, very softly, he said, "I was going to say that I think I'm falling in love with you, and it terrifies me. But not as much as the thought of leaving terrifies me now." Her heart stopped, started, raced. "Oh, I know I have no right. Know I'm damaged goods and that you could do better. Know we haven't even had a proper marriage ceremony, and I'm still sleeping in your barn like a hired hand. But it's true. And I thought you should know." She looked at him, really looked at him, seeing past the scars and the fear to the man underneath. The man who'd paid for a stranger's doctor bills, who'd learned to make bread because she needed help, who'd stayed when everything in him screamed to run. The man who'd risked his heart after 20 years of protecting it because somehow against all odds, she'd made him believe healing was possible. "You're not damaged goods," she said firmly. "You're healing, and She took a breath, steadying herself. "I think I'm falling in love with you too. Have been for weeks, probably, but I was afraid to admit it, afraid you'd run if I put a name to this thing growing between us." "I'm not running." He said it like a vow. "Not anymore. I'm staying, Evelyn. If you'll have me, really have me. Not just as a hired hand or a partner, but as a husband, as someone who loves you and wants to build a life with you." "I'll have you." The words came easily, naturally, like they'd been waiting to be spoken all along. "I'll have you exactly as you are, nightmares and scars and all, because you're the best man I've ever known, and I'd be honored to be your wife." He pulled her into his arms then, carefully, giving her time to pull back if she wanted to. But she didn't want to. She wrapped her arms around him and held on tight, feeling his heart beating hard against hers, feeling the tremor in his hands as he held her like she was something precious and fragile and worth protecting. They stood like that for a long time, holding each other in the lamplight, two broken people who'd somehow found a way to be whole together. And when they finally pulled apart, Jonah was smiling, truly smiling, with no shadow of fear or doubt behind it. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow we'll go see Reverend Thomas. Make this official. Make it real." "Tomorrow," she agreed. "Tonight, you're moving into the house, into that storage room we talked about. No more sleeping in the barn, Jonah. You're home now, really home." "Yes, ma'am," he grinned. "I believe I am." They moved his belongings into the house that very night, though there wasn't much to move, just his canvas bag with a few changes of clothes, a worn Bible his mother had given him before he left for war, and a small wooden box containing letters from his sister that he'd carried for years. Evelyn helped him clear out the storage room, pushing aside crates of her father's old tools and her mother's carefully preserved linens to make space for a proper bed. They worked side by side in the lamplight, neither speaking much, both acutely aware that something fundamental had shifted between them. When the room was finally ready, Jonah stood in the doorway looking at the narrow bed with its clean sheets and hand-stitched quilt, and Evelyn saw his throat work as he swallowed hard. "I never thought I'd have this again," he said quietly. "A room in a real house, a place that feels like it might be permanent." "It is permanent. As permanent as you want it to be." She touched his arm gently. "This is your home now, Jonah. Not just a place you're staying until something better comes along. Home." He turned to her, and in the soft light she saw his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I don't know how to thank you for that, for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself." "You don't need to thank me. You earned this, every bit of it." She smiled. "Now get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be a big day." But neither of them could sleep. Evelyn lay in her loft listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another person in the house, the creak of bed springs as Jonah settled in, the soft sound of pages turning as he read from his Bible, the eventual quiet of his breathing as he finally drifted off. And she thought about tomorrow, about standing before Reverend Thomas and making vows that would bind her life to this man's, and she felt no fear at all, only a deep, settled certainty that this was right, that they were right. Dawn came cold and clear, frost painting intricate patterns on the windows. Evelyn woke to the smell of coffee already brewing and descended to find Jonah dressed in his best shirt, which wasn't saying much, attempting to tame his hair with water from the basin. "Morning," she said, and he turned with a smile that transformed his whole face. "Morning. I made coffee. Thought you might need it." He paused, studying her. "Are you nervous?" "Should I be?" "I am. Terrified, actually. What if I say the wrong thing? What if Reverend Thomas takes one look at me and decides I'm not fit to marry you? Then we'll find someone else to perform the ceremony. Or we'll do it ourselves, with just the two of us, and God as witnesses." She poured herself coffee. "But that won't happen. The Reverend's a good man. He'll marry us." They drove to Hollow Creek in the wagon, both dressed in their Sunday best, which for ranch folk meant clothes without visible patches or stains. The town was quiet, most people still at home finishing their morning chores. At the church, they found Reverend Thomas sweeping the steps, and he looked up with pleased surprise when he saw them. "Miss Hart, Mr. Pierce, this is an unexpected pleasure." "We've come about that conversation we had," Evelyn said, suddenly feeling shy. "About making our arrangement official. If you're willing, we'd like to be married, today, if possible." The Reverend's face broke into a warm smile. "Nothing would please me more. Come inside, let me get my book." He paused, looking between them. "Do you have witnesses? The law requires 2. "We didn't think about that," Jonah admitted. "Not to worry. Let me send my boy to fetch the Pattersons. They'll be delighted to stand witness, I'm sure." Within the hour, they were standing before the altar in the small church, with Mr. and Mrs. Patterson beaming from the front pew and Reverend Thomas reading from his worn prayer book. The ceremony was simple, traditional, the words unchanged for centuries. But when Jonah took Evelyn's hands in his and repeated his vows, his voice steady despite the tremor in his fingers, she felt the weight and truth of every promise. "I, Jonah Pierce, take you, Evelyn Hart, to be my lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." And when it was her turn, she looked into his storm cloud eyes and saw the boy he'd been, the soldier he'd survived being, and the man he was becoming, and she meant every word with her whole heart. "I, Evelyn Hart, take you, Jonah Pierce, to be my lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." They had no rings to exchange. That was a luxury neither could afford. But Reverend Thomas blessed their union anyway, and when he pronounced them husband and wife, Jonah kissed her softly, reverently, as if she might break. It was their first real kiss, and it tasted of coffee and hope and the promise of all the tomorrows they'd face together. Mrs. Patterson cried happy tears and insisted on throwing them a small celebration at the Mercantile, where she produced a cake she'd apparently baked in anticipation of this very event. "I knew you two would come to your senses eventually," she declared, cutting generous slices. "Anyone with eyes could see you belonged together." Word spread quickly through the small town, and by the time they left for the ranch in the early afternoon, half of Hollow Creek had stopped by to offer congratulations and wish them well. Emma Sullivan gave Evelyn a knowing smile and whispered, "I'm glad you found someone worthy of you." Even Mr. Morrison, usually a man of few words, shook Jonah's hand and said gruffly, "You treat her right, you hear? She's good people." "I hear," Jonah promised, "and I will." The ride home was quiet, both of them processing the enormity of what they'd done. They were married now, legally bound, their lives officially intertwined. It was what they'd both wanted, but the reality of it felt overwhelming in the best possible way. "Are you sorry?" Jonah asked as they crested the rise that overlooked their ranch. "That we didn't have a fancy wedding with flowers and a white dress and all the things brides are supposed to want?" "Not even a little." Evelyn looked at the land spread out before them, their land now, legally and officially. "I got exactly what I wanted. A good man, an honest vow, and the promise of building something real together. What more could I need?" "A lot of women would say you deserve more." "Then a lot of women don't know what actually matters." She reached over and squeezed his hand. "I'm happy, Jonah. Truly, deeply happy. And I haven't felt that way in longer than I can remember." That night, for the first time, they didn't retreat to separate spaces after supper. Instead, they sat together by the fire, Evelyn in her rocking chair and Jonah in his, talking quietly about their plans for the ranch, for the coming winter, for the spring planting. It was domestic and comfortable and utterly ordinary, and perhaps that was what made it so extraordinary, the simple miracle of not being alone. "I should tell you," Jonah said eventually, his voice carefully casual, "that I still expect to have nightmares. Marriage doesn't cure trauma. We both know that." "I know, and when you have them, I'll be here to help you through them. That's what partners do, what spouses do." "Are you sure you're ready for that? It's not easy living with someone who—" "Jonah," she interrupted him gently but firmly, "I married you knowing exactly who you are, nightmares included. I'm not going to run away the first time things get difficult, and I'm not going to let you run away either. We're in this together now, for better or worse, remember?" "For better or worse," he echoed and smiled. "I'm going to hold you to that when I'm driving you crazy 6 months from now." "Good. Because I plan to hold you to it when I'm doing the same to you." They went to their separate beds that night, his in the small room downstairs, hers in the loft. But both slept more soundly than they had in months, knowing they were no longer alone in the house, no longer facing the darkness by themselves. The weeks that followed were a study in adjustment and compromise. They had to learn to share space that had previously been solely Evelyn's, had to navigate the small intimacies of married life without the benefit of courtship or gradual progression. There were awkward moments, Jonah walking in while she was washing up, both of them reaching for the same dish and bumping hands, the strange dance of learning each other's routines and rhythms. But there were beautiful moments too. Jonah teaching her to read weather signs in the clouds the way old cowboys had taught him. Evelyn showing him how to make her mother's apple butter, laughing when he burned the first batch and celebrating when the second turned out perfect. Long evenings spent reading aloud to each other from her father's small library, discovering shared love of adventure stories and Western tales. The nightmares came, as they both knew they would. But they came less frequently now, and when they did, Evelyn was there. The bell system they'd installed proved its worth more than once. Jonah would ring his bell when he woke confused or frightened, and Evelyn would come to him, talking him back to reality with her calm voice and steady presence. And slowly, gradually, the episodes became shorter, less intense, as if his mind was learning to trust that he was truly safe. Winter arrived in earnest in late November, bringing snow that piled high against the barn and temperatures that dropped so low the water in the trough froze solid every night. But they were prepared. The firewood was stacked high, the pantry was full, the animals were secure. And when the blizzards came, howling across the prairie with fury and ice, they stayed inside by the fire, warm and safe and together. It was during one of these storms, when they'd been snowed in for 3 days and were beginning to feel the cabin fever that came from too much confinement, that a letter arrived. The mail carrier, making his rounds on snowshoes, handed Jonah an envelope with a Kansas City postmark and a feminine hand. "It's from Margaret," Jonah said, his voice filled with wonder and fear. My sister wrote back. "Open it," Evelyn urged, as excited as he was nervous. With shaking hands, he broke the seal and unfolded several pages covered in neat script. As he read, his expression shifted from anxiety to disbelief to something that looked like joy mixed with tears. "She forgives me," he whispered, "for the years of silence, for disappearing, for everything. She says she always knew I was struggling, always hoped I'd find my way to peace eventually. And she's happy for me, happy that I found you, that I'm married, that I've finally found a place to stay." Oh, Jonah. Evelyn felt tears prick her own eyes. She wants to visit. In the spring, when the weather clears, she wants to bring her family, her husband and children, to meet you, to see the ranch, to reconnect. He looked up from the letter, his face transformed. "I have a sister again. A family. Because of you, because you gave me a reason to stop running, I have a family again. You always had a family. You just needed to believe you deserved to reach out to them." She moved to his side, reading over his shoulder. "And now you'll get to meet your nieces and nephews. That's wonderful." He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight, and she felt wetness on her shoulder where his tears soaked through her dress. "Thank you," he said roughly, "for giving me back my life, for making me believe I could have this. You gave yourself back your life. I just provided a safe place to do it." Christmas came quietly, just the two of them celebrating with a modest feast and small gifts. A new work shirt she'd sewn for him, a carved wooden box he'd made for her sewing supplies. They attended Christmas service in town, standing together in the crowded church, and afterward several families invited them for dinner. They chose the Johnsons, wanting to see how little Emma was recovering, and found the child completely well, running and playing with her siblings as if she'd never been sick at all. "Thank you again," Mrs. Johnson said, pulling Evelyn aside, "for saving her life, for caring when you didn't have to. Anyone would have done the same." "No, they wouldn't have. Most folks look out for their own and let others struggle. You and your husband are different, good different." She pressed a small package into Evelyn's hands. "It's not much, just some jam I put up last summer, but I wanted you to have something from us. A thank you that comes from the heart." Evelyn accepted the gift with gratitude, and as she and Jonah drove home through the snowy evening, she thought about community and connection and all the ways their decision to help one family had rippled out to create new bonds, new friendships. "We're part of something here," she said to Jonah. "Part of this town, this community. We're not just surviving anymore, we're living. We're building something that matters." "We are," he agreed, "and it feels good, feels right." The new year arrived with bitter cold and clear skies, and with it came a confidence in their partnership that hadn't existed before. They moved through their days with increasing synchronicity, anticipating each other's needs, finishing each other's thoughts. The awkwardness of early marriage faded, replaced by comfortable familiarity and deepening affection. One night in late January, Jonah came to Evelyn as she was preparing for bed and asked quietly, "May I sleep up here, in the loft, with you?" She'd been waiting for this question, knowing it would come when he was ready, and she answered without hesitation. "Yes, I'd like that." So he brought his things up the ladder, and for the first time since their marriage, they shared a bed. Nothing more than sleeping, lying close in the winter darkness, drawing comfort from each other's presence. But it was significant nonetheless, a final barrier crossed, a last reservation released. "I'm not afraid anymore," Jonah whispered in the darkness, "of hurting you, of failing you, of being too broken to love you properly. You've shown me that healing is possible, that I'm not defined by my worst moments. No, you're not. You're defined by the choices you make every day. And you choose kindness, choose hard work, choose to be present even when it's difficult. That's who you are, Jonah Pierce. That's the man I married." He kissed her then, softly at first, then with growing confidence and passion. And as winter winds howled outside and snow piled against the windows, they finally became husband and wife in every sense of the word, two wounded souls finding wholeness in each other's arms. February brought the worst storm of the season, a blizzard that lasted 5 days and buried the ranch under 4 feet of snow. They were trapped inside, venturing out only to care for the animals, and even that was treacherous work. But they had supplies enough, and each other, and somehow the confinement felt less like prison and more like cocoon, a space where they could exist separate from the world and focus entirely on building their life together. During those days, Jonah told her stories he'd never shared with anyone, memories from before the war, from his childhood on the Illinois farm, from the boy he'd been who'd loved fishing in the creek and helping his father with the harvest. And Evelyn told him about her mother, about the brief 9 years she'd had with her before the fatal childbirth, about the guilt she'd carried for years. "I used to think I'd stolen my mother's life by being born," she confessed one evening as they sat by the fire. "That I owed my father a debt I could never repay because my existence cost him the person he loved most." Did he feel that way? No. He told me repeatedly that my mother chose me, knew the risks, and chose me anyway. But children don't always believe what they're told, especially about complicated things like love and sacrifice. She leaned against Jonah's shoulder. "It wasn't until I met you that I understood what he meant. That sometimes love means choosing someone even when it's risky, even when it might cost you something. You took a risk on me, on this ranch, on staying when everything in you wanted to run. And I took a risk on you, on bringing a stranger into my home and my life. We both chose this, knowing it might not work out. And because we chose it, because we keep choosing it, it does work." "I'll keep choosing you," he promised. "Every day for the rest of my life, I'll keep choosing you." When the storm finally broke and they dug their way out to find the world transformed by snow, they stood together in the doorway and marveled at the beauty of it. The prairie stretched white and pristine to the horizon, unmarked except by the tracks of small animals brave enough to venture out. The sky was impossibly blue, and the sun glinted off the snow like scattered diamonds. "It's beautiful," Evelyn breathed. "I never get tired of seeing this land, seeing how it changes with the seasons." "Neither do I." But Jonah was looking at her, not the landscape. "I never thought I'd find this. A home. A wife who understands me. A life worth living." "You found it because you were brave enough to stop running." "No, I found it because you were brave enough to let me stay." March brought the first hints of spring, days when the temperature rose above freezing and the snow began to melt in earnest. The creek swelled with runoff, and the first brave shoots of green appeared in sheltered spots where the sun hit longest. And with the changing season came news that both thrilled and terrified them. Evelyn was pregnant. She'd suspected for a few weeks but hadn't said anything, afraid to hope, afraid to believe her body could actually carry a child to term given her mother's history. But when she finally worked up the courage to tell Jonah, his reaction was everything she could have wanted. "A baby," he repeated, wonder in his voice. "We're going to have a baby. If all goes well, I'm scared, Jonah. My mother died giving birth to me. What if—" "Don't." He took her hands firmly. "Don't borrow trouble from tomorrow. We'll get the best doctor, take every precaution, and we'll face whatever comes together. But don't assume the worst. You're strong, Evelyn. Stronger than you know." "I hope you're right." "I am right. And even if I'm scared too, which I am, we'll be scared together. That's what marriage is, right? Being scared together and doing the hard things anyway?" She laughed despite her fear. "I suppose it is." They told no one for several weeks, wanting to keep the news private until they were certain everything was progressing well. But eventually word leaked out, as it always did in small towns, and suddenly they were receiving visits from every woman in Hollow Creek who'd ever had a child, all of them offering advice and hand-me-down baby clothes and dire warnings about everything that could go wrong. Mrs. Patterson appointed herself Evelyn's guardian angel, stopping by weekly to check on her and deliver vegetables and meat to keep your strength up. Emma Sullivan knitted tiny booties and bonnets. Ruth Morrison shared her own story of difficult pregnancies overcome, offering hope when Evelyn's courage flagged. And through it all, Jonah was there, more protective than ever, insisting on taking over the heaviest chores watching her with an expression that mixed joy and terror in equal measure. He read everything he could find about pregnancy and childbirth, asked the doctor 100 questions when they made their monthly visits to town, and started building a cradle in the barn with such care and attention to detail that Evelyn knew it would be a masterpiece. April brought Margaret's promised visit. She arrived with her husband, Thomas, and their 3 children, 2 girls and a boy ranging in age from 6 to 12, and the moment Jonah saw his sister step down from the stage, something in him that had remained tense finally released. They embraced on the platform in full view of curious townspeople, both of them crying, both of them talking at once, trying to fit 20 years of separation into a single moment. Evelyn hung back, giving them space, but Margaret soon pulled her into the embrace as well. "You're the miracle worker," Margaret said through her tears. "You're the one who gave me back my brother. I can never thank you enough for that. I didn't give him back. He found his own way. I just provided a safe place to land. However it happened, I'm grateful." Margaret held her at arm's length, studying her with sharp eyes so like Jonah's. "And you're going to have a baby. Jonah wrote me. That's wonderful news." The week of Margaret's visit was one of the happiest of Jonah's life. He showed his nieces and nephews around the ranch, teaching them to ride and helping them collect eggs from the chickens. He stayed up late talking with Margaret and Thomas, filling in all the years of silence with stories of where he'd been and what he'd done. And he introduced them to the community they'd built in Hollow Creek, clearly proud to show his sister the life he'd made. On the last evening of their visit, as everyone sat around the fire after supper, Margaret said quietly, "I can see you're happy, Jonah. Really, truly happy. You look different than you did before the war. Lighter somehow, despite everything you've carried. I am happy. Happier than I ever thought I could be." He reached for Evelyn's hand. "I found what I'd been looking for without knowing I was looking. Found home. I'm glad." Margaret's eyes were bright with tears. "You deserve this. You always did, even when you couldn't see it yourself." After Margaret's family left, heading back to Kansas City with promises to return soon and invitations for Jonah and Evelyn to visit in turn, the ranch felt quiet. But it was a comfortable quiet, the kind that came from being complete rather than empty. "Thank you for being so welcoming to my sister," Jonah said that night as they prepared for bed. "I know having house guests for a week when you're expecting must have been exhausting." "It was wonderful. Seeing you with your family, seeing how happy you were, that was worth any exhaustion." She smiled at him. "Besides, our child should know their aunt and cousins. Family's important." "It is." He placed his hand gently on her still flat stomach. "And this child is going to have the best mother in Dakota Territory. I'm sure of it." Summer arrived with heat and long days of hard work in the fields. They planted crops with help from neighbors, everyone pitching in as was the custom in ranch country. The community that had once been merely polite to Evelyn now embraced them both fully, accepting Jonah as one of their own. He was no longer the mysterious stranger who'd stepped off the train looking half dead, but Jonah Pierce, good neighbor and reliable friend. As Evelyn's pregnancy progressed and her belly swelled with their growing child, Jonah became increasingly protective. He insisted she rest more, work less, let him handle everything heavy or strenuous. She protested at first, unused to being coddled, but eventually gave in because she could see how much he needed to feel useful, to feel like he was protecting his family. "I'm not made of glass," she complained one afternoon when he'd physically lifted her onto the porch swing and forbidden her to move. "I know, but you're carrying something precious, and I'll be damned if I let anything happen to either of you because I didn't take proper care." His voice was fierce with protective love. "Humor me, Evelyn. Let me do this." So she humored him and found that letting someone care for her wasn't as hard as she'd always thought it would be. Found that accepting help didn't make her weak, just made her smart enough to recognize she couldn't do everything alone. August brought the harvest, and with it a sense of accomplishment and satisfaction. The crops they'd planted together had flourished, providing more than enough to see them through the next winter with surplus to sell. The cattle had thrived, producing healthy calves that would strengthen their herd. The ranch that Evelyn had barely managed to keep afloat alone now prospered under their combined efforts. "We did this," she said to Jonah one evening as they surveyed their fields, Together, we made this place not just survive, but thrive. We did, and we'll keep doing it, year after year, building something that will outlast us both. September arrived with cooler weather and the knowledge that the baby would come soon. Evelyn was huge now, uncomfortable and eager to meet the child she'd been carrying for 8 months. The doctor had examined her the previous week and declared everything progressing normally, but she couldn't shake her fear, couldn't forget that her own mother had died bringing her into the world. "What if something goes wrong?" she asked Jonah late one night when she couldn't sleep for worry. "What if the baby's fine but I'm not? What if you're left alone with a child to raise?" "Nothing's going to go wrong." He held her close, his hand resting protectively on her belly. "But if something did, and it won't, but if it did, I'd raise our child knowing they were loved by both parents. I'd tell them about their brave mother who gave them life, and I'd make sure they grew up knowing they were wanted and cherished. Promise me." "I promise. But I won't need to keep that promise because you're going to be fine. We're both going to be fine, all three of us." The contractions started on a cool morning in late September, gentle at first but building steadily. Jonah rode to town to fetch the doctor and returned with both the doctor and Mrs. Patterson, who announced she was staying to help whether they wanted her to or not. "I've birthed 6 children and helped with a dozen more," she declared. "You'll want experienced hands here, and mine are as experienced as they come." The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the day and into the night, and beyond into the next morning. Evelyn had never known pain like this, never imagined her body capable of such intensity of sensation. But through it all, Jonah stayed by her side, holding her hand, wiping her forehead, whispering encouragement and love. "You can do this," he told her again and again. "You're the strongest person I know. You can do anything." And finally, as the sun broke over the horizon, painting the sky gold and rose, she gave one final push and their daughter entered the world, tiny and perfect, and wailing with outrage at being expelled from her warm nest. "It's a girl," the doctor announced, placing the squirming, crying bundle on Evelyn's chest. "Healthy and strong. Well done, Mrs. Pierce." Evelyn looked down at her daughter, at the tiny fists waving, at the dark hair plastered to her small skull, at eyes that would likely turn gray like her father's, and felt a love so fierce it nearly stopped her heart. "She's perfect," she breathed. "Jonah, look at her. She's absolutely perfect." Jonah was crying openly, tears streaming down his face as he touched their daughter's tiny hand with one gentle finger. "She's beautiful. She's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." "What will you name her?" Mrs. Patterson asked, beaming like a proud grandmother. Evelyn looked at Jonah, and he nodded, understanding without words what she wanted. "Hope," Evelyn said. "Her name is Hope, because that's what we found together, and that's what we want to give her." The weeks that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and endless feedings, of learning to care for a helpless infant while still managing the ranch work. But they navigated it together, taking shifts so the other could sleep, supporting each other through the exhaustion and the moments of panic when Hope cried inconsolably and they had no idea what she needed. And slowly, gradually, they found their rhythm as parents, the same way they'd found their rhythm as partners, through patience and communication and the willingness to keep trying even when things were hard. On a golden October afternoon, when Hope was 3 weeks old and sleeping peacefully in the cradle Jonah had built, they stood together on their porch and looked out at the land that had brought them together and the life they'd built from nothing but hope and determination and love. "Are you happy?" Evelyn asked, though she already knew the answer. "Happier than I ever dreamed I could be." Jonah wrapped his arm around her waist, careful of her still healing body. "I came here broken, convinced I'd never be whole again. But you showed me that healing is possible, that home is possible, that love is possible, even for someone as damaged as I was. You were never damaged, just wounded. And wounds heal, given time and care and the right conditions." She leaned against him. "We healed each other, I think. I was lonely and losing hope, and you were lost and afraid to stay anywhere. But together, we found what we were both missing." "We did." He kissed the top of her head. "And we'll keep finding it every day for the rest of our lives." Inside the house, Hope stirred and made a soft sound. not quite a cry, but a request for attention. They went to her together, as they did everything now, and Evelyn lifted their daughter into her arms while Jonah stood close, his hand on Evelyn's shoulder, the three of them forming a unit, a family, a home. And on the hill overlooking the ranch, beneath the cottonwood tree where Evelyn's mother rested, a hawk landed and watched the small house with its warm yellow light spilling from the windows. Watched the family gathered there, bound by love and forged in fire. Watched the man who'd forgotten how to stay finally learning what it meant to be home. The seasons would continue to turn. Winter would come again, and spring after it, and summer and fall in their endless cycle. There would be hard times ahead. There always were on a ranch, in a life. There would be struggles and setbacks, arguments and reconciliations, days when the work felt too hard and the weight too heavy. But they would face it all together, Jonah and Evelyn and little Hope, building their life one day at a time, one choice at a time, one small act of love and commitment at a time. And years later, when their daughter was grown and bringing her own children to visit the ranch, she would ask them to tell the story of how they met, how they fell in love, how they built this life from nothing. And Evelyn would smile and look at Jonah, at the man who'd arrived broken and learned to heal, at the husband who'd stayed when staying was the hardest thing he'd ever done, at the father who'd given their children a legacy of hope and resilience and stubborn, enduring love. And she would say simply, "Your father came to me too broken to love, but I called him home anyway, and he answered, and that made all the difference." The end.